Alright guys, William here back with a new video, and in this video we're back with another retrospective for Big Brother season. We're here 20 years after its initial airing. I'll be talking about the entirety of Big Brother 6, a very important season of reality television to many people, me included, particularly the fact that this was the first season of Big Brother that I watched that truly got me invested into the show. While I watched portions of BB5, and some of those moments do stick to my mind, it really was BB6 that really got me into the show and really made me into the fan that I am today. And so much of the season obviously comes off very iconic, but in a way that is a bit strange in retrospect. In fact, that this is a season that is very much filled with great characters, great drama, big character moments, and again, some big plays here and there, but really a game that and is kind of the epitome of a split house dynamic on Big Brother, but also is a season that maybe is a bit lacking in terms of overall gameplay, a relatively slow season from a gameplay front, but one that again just has so many iconic characters and moments within it that really makes it stand amongst the best Big Brother seasons of all time. But like my other retrospectives, I will be talking about the season from beginning to end. Let's get started with week 1, which is a pretty jam-packed premiere episode where typically in the past we usually spend episodes to get to the first HOH and the first nominations, yet we do all that in the first episode of the season here, which again was very abnormal. But it does start off with Julie saying that's a new season, a new house, and new house guests, dubbing it the Summer of Secrets. Obviously, that being the theme of the season, and it really living up to that in multiple facets. First, in the fact that we get a new Big Brother house, with them really hyping up the fact that it's 2 stories. And obviously, this is the Big Brother house that we know today, the one that's still used to this day. Again, its first implementation here allows for some intrigue in the sense that, again, because no one knows the actual full layout of the house, it does allow for rooms to be secret and be revealed over time. And again, I think that's an aspect of the season that is, again, kind of cool that you never know what exactly the house is hiding. But beyond that, we also reveal that we are getting 14 players entering the house, the largest grouping up to this point to enter the house on day 1. Though with the reveal that there is one secret so astonishing it will change how the game is played. Kind of. I mean, to be honest, it didn't really change that much. But it is the reveal that everyone will be playing with somebody that they know from the outside world, with each pair believing that they're the only ones with a secret partner. And the reveal that if one of those duos makes it to the end, they get $1 million. And again, all this, a really fun twist. Something that I'm shocked they never brought back again. This concept of secret partners is something that, again, adds some interesting dynamics to the show. Also, it's just a fun gimmick here. And while ultimately, I don't know if it really pays off too well here, where really these partnerships don't play the biggest factor in the game, it is, again, just a fun casting twist that I'm kind of surprised that we just never saw them attempt again. And to be fair, I do think there are some downsides to it, particularly in the fact that it is essentially a glorified Blood vs. Water season, where, again, that is kind of the issue Blood vs. Water seasons with newbies, is the concept that more times than not, you're going to find one interesting person. It's going to be a struggle to find 2 interesting people that are willing to do the show. And I think because that usually leads to a certain person getting on the cast simply because of who their partner is. And again, that could definitely weaken the cast as a whole. But again, it worked out for this season at least. And obviously, again, this $1 million prize obviously gives them this incentive for them to be working together. Though, again, it didn't feel like it played that much of a factor, as, again, I just felt like most people were pretty content with the fact that, obviously, they weren't getting to the end to get that $1 million. And really, if anything, it actually just create a bigger bullseye on these partnerships' backs by the end of the season. But anyway, another interesting aspect of this cast is the fact that you do notice that it's uneven gender-wise, that there are 8 women, 6 men. And the reason for that is because Sarah was a last-second replacement here, where James had a male friend that was going to be in the house, where, again, it would have been a 7-7 split, though had to drop out pretty last second. Again, this is another thing that ultimately doesn't play too much of a factor. For while there's a lot of initial talk about these like gender-based alliances, they never fully come together. Though by the end of the season, again, I don't think it's a coincidence that this is the only time, again, all-female Final Four, where obviously, this is something that made that a lot more likely. But anyway, we get to the player intros, which are still the cheesy one-liners we get in the old school Big Brother. Though, again, some interesting introductions here. First from Yvette, who says that I got a secret house guest will never guess, and proceeds to kiss her girlfriend. Where, again, she ends up being the first openly lesbian player in Big Brother US, which is nice to see that representation here, even though Yvette herself ends up being a bit problematic at points. But still, we then get to Kaser, who ends up refusing to bow down the competition as they show him praying, where obviously, again, Kaser is someone that is cast here as the first Muslim player on Big Brother US, also the child of Iraqi immigrants, in a spot where obviously the midst of the Iraq war. And I think having someone like Kaser on the reality show, especially coming off extremely well, and obviously becoming a massive fan favorite, my personal favorite as a kid, obviously this ends up being great representation in a very tense time with a lot of Islamophobia going around, where, again, just a few years after 9/11, to where, again, I do think having someone like Kaser on Big Brother being such a great representative of his community and was something that was really impactful at the time. But beyond that, we do see the players coming out to the front door one by one and entering the house with the reveal that everyone will be sleeping in the same room because they just have a big open bedroom, which again, kind of weird that they did that on this season. So again, there aren't enough beds for the players, so some people end up having to sleep in sleeping bags, in a spot where we instantly get a fight right away between Janelle and Eric, with them bickering over it, with them clearly not getting along from the very beginning, with Eric pointing out nasty look that she gave him, where we do end up getting a lot of focus on Eric during this first week, getting a lot of his perspective in a spot where I think it was pretty clear he was a production favorite from the very beginning, which led to a lot of ire towards him from the more online fan base over the next couple weeks. But right away, we see the guys going off on their own, with the girls thinking that they're making a guys alliance already, where obviously this is in the aftermath of the Four Horsemen, to where I'm sure that was fresh in their minds. But again, clearly this potential gender divide was something in people's minds early on the season, but ultimately, again, it doesn't end up sticking beyond these first few days. But we do instantly see Kaser and Michael checking out the bathroom near the showers, with Michael already saying that he knows who he's going to be showering with because he needed to make a creepy comment right away. And again, just in general, Michael just comes off so creepy on the rewatch here. But again, clearly you could see this rapport right away between Michael and Kaser. Kaser just telling him to take it easy, and to where, again, it was pretty obvious that they were partners from the offset here. But anyway, when they get the players introducing themselves to each other, with Michael awkwardly joking about how he's 38, with there being a big reaction, only for him to reveal he's 28. Also, then we get talk about how great Rachel looks for being 33, which I found so funny. How 33 is considered like so old in this spot. And we then get introduced to Bo, with Eric joking around how it's not hard to find who the gay guy is. Only then say, but who cares? It's interesting, which weird comment, but too fair for the year of 2005. This is probably pretty progressive. And in general, Eric actually is surprisingly someone that is somewhat progressive on this cast, in a spot where, again, I think you would expect him, again, being this like firefighter, to have like conservative leanings, when in reality he's actually probably the person that comes off the most like openly liberal on the cast. To be fair, he does have his share of problematic moments as well. But then we get introduced to Janelle through Howie talking about how hot she is, and Yvette talking about how she's a mini Pam Anderson and not natural, with Yvette clearly not liking her from the very beginning here and holding this like resentment against her the entire season. All Howie is just Howie here. But really, Janelle ends up getting a pretty quiet edit early on here, where it really feels like the edit during this first week really just reduces her to just her being the hot one. Also, here we have Howie introducing himself right from the beginning as Hurricane Howie, bragging about how little he has to get right as a meteorologist, where we follow this up with James getting introduced to us by saying that he thought he was suffering from our wordation, which, again, James has clearly not aged well. Though you can clearly tell he was meant to be this like kind of like pseudo Dr. Will figure, getting this like strategic content right away, lying about being a teacher, and laughing about how he's never been a teacher in his entire life. But also ends up having, again, a questionable comment following this, saying how he's worried about the girls because they're sneakier and more evil and better liars, which is very ironic coming from James based on his reputation outside the show. But either way, when they get introduced to Maggie, who is a nurse, and that's pretty much all we know about her early on, with the vet saying that if anything happens, she can help, only for Maggie to say it all depends, and it says, oh, I'm just kidding, as we might learn later on. I mean, is she? But anyway, we get to the first comp of the season, it being a mixed food and HOH comp, where, again, very quick to get into a competition for actual power for early Big Brother here. But really feeling they had to rush through a lot in this premiere here just to get to nominations by the end of the episode. Where for this opening week, they only did get 3 episodes, in a spot where obviously typically they get more, where there ends up even being a pretty big gap between this and the following episode, to where it makes you question, like, why didn't they just premiere later? But either way, at this point, the players end up getting their swimsuits, leading to Howie talking about how we have some good-looking females here, because that's most of Howie's content. All the comp has them being split into 2 teams, with them essentially playing basketball, like getting coconuts from a tree on one side of the board and moving them to the front, where they shoot them to the big kahuna, which was just a really bad challenge from a TV perspective, as it was very difficult to even follow, like, who's on what team, where, again, considering we just got introduced to these players, I think just, like, clumping them together into these big groups that we have no stakes in was, again, not the greatest for the television product here. But either way, it ends up being a blowout here for the team containing Howie, Janelle, April, James, Sarah, Rachel, and Maggie, winning 23-7. But this leads into part 2 of the challenge, the HOH comp, which is an endurance of who can stand on the board the longest. But right away, we do actually get some savviness here from Janelle leading the conversation and making an agreement for everyone to keep each other safe for the first 2 weeks, which obviously ends up being the optimal play in this spot and really ends up kind of screwing over this team that lost this challenge, really making it so that one of them is going to be the first boots, which really was always going to be the ramifications of a challenge like this that has them being split into 2 groups, with one of those groups being the HOH. But anyway, the challenge ends up lasting 2.5 hours despite them making a deal where I guess it was them maybe trying to keep their cover, but again, they did stand out there for quite a while. But it does come down to Howie and Rachel, with Howie ended up giving Rachel the win. And what ends up being a very stable first HOH. Again, very little actual gameplay revolving around the nominations that actually end up mattering. But right away, we do see Ashlea talking about feeling vulnerable, and Kaser talking about standing out due to him being Muslim and Iraqi. So I wonder who the noms are going to be. But we do see Kaser having a fairly accurate read here of what's going to happen, thinking that the other group is obviously going to make a deal to save each other, with Michael saying that he's just being paranoid, which also shows Michael just being kind of an idiot. But again, we do get some more content around Kaser, which comes off very sympathetic, and see him talk about praying 5 times a day and him bond with Ashlea over that. And her talking about how getting to know him makes you lose your biases, which is good content there. Oh, we then get some strategy here from Eric, who talks to Michael and Kaser, saying that the girls are going to be picking them off, and that the guys need to stick together, where again, we do see this guys alliance coming together, which again leads to questionable content from Eric here, talking about how like Bo is one of the girls and Howie will sway wherever, and again forms this initial alliance between them and James, making a deal here saying that his word is all he has in his life, and he surely will never go back on that ever, because that's not something Eric does. But again, Eric just coming out very aggressive from the very beginning, playing very hard, which really just continues to escalate during his run here. But we do see Rachel getting her HOH room, again the first appearance of the now iconic HOH room, obviously much bigger than the previous seasons. But we end up seeing her also pulling in people one by one, ultimately landing on Ashley and Kaser as the nominations, with Maggie here pointing out that Rachel is a player and that she's also playing from day one, which again, if this was a season that could have a winner edit, I guess that would be a very winner quote. But kind of weird in the fact that we do get a lot of like Maggie content of her being kind of anti-Rachel due to her knowing how good of a player she is, in a spot where she was actually working with Rachel at this point, where again at this point in the game there was already a 4-person alliance between Rachel, Maggie, Eric, and Yvette that seemed to be the initial core of the game, which again never really gets shown on the show, but again it's very weird how like that grouping was there, yet all we really see of Maggie is just her being kind of anti-Rachel. But anyway, we also do get a segment here about Jennifer flirting with all the guys, which really just felt like set up to her being a red herring, as we do see James proceed to, again, not come off well here, saying that she needs to go and it'll be one evil woman down. Where he ends up campaigning to Rachel against her, though that ultimately doesn't lead to anything, where we ultimately get nominations, and it is Kaser versus Ashlea, with Ashlea crying, which is like kind of funny, as it turns out that she never really even talked to Rachel, so it's like I don't know what she really expected. But to be fair, like Ashlea just never really clicked with most of this house, and also did supposedly tell Maggie that Eric can't be trusted, which made her a target as well, which, I mean, really a lot of people do this to Maggie, and she just relays that back to Eric, which again, credit to Eric and Maggie for keeping their relationship secret enough for people to do that, but really just feels like a reoccurring trend across the first few weeks here. But again, we see Ashlea here saying that she's not going down fighting, which surely not. But again, we get to episode 2, again aired 5 days after the premiere, but we once again do get a lot of focus around Kaser, first in him telling Rachel he respects her decision, and her saying that you're a great guy, Kaser, which again just feels like them trying to make us obviously know that Kaser's a good guy, and again it leads to Kaser praying and talking about the struggles of playing the game that contradicts with his religion and wants to play with integrity, but does talk about how he just wants to show that he's real and just a normal, nice guy, which you can very much tell just how much weight there was on Kaser's back here over how much he wanted to be a great representative of his community, and again I think he largely succeeds at that. Thankfully the edit backs him up as well, but again talks about how he needs to put himself out there more to stay this week, where we do see him instantly bonding with Bo on a cultural level, which again was nice content for really both of them there. But beyond that, we do get a segment here about Howie, with him just again coming off as a really over-the-top character, talking about how Janelle is out of his age range because he only dates 18 to 23-year-olds, again as a 34-year-old man, which is kind of icky. But beyond that, we do get a pretty funny little moment to me me of him talking to Bo and asking him why he's here, with Bo saying that he's here to enlighten people about his lifestyle, with Howie saying you think people should be personal shoppers, and only for there to be a long pause before Bo just says, I'm gay. But again, funny little moment, though it does turn into a weird segment about how like Howie's bi-curious and like pretends that he's gay, which kind of problematic. But anyway, we also get a segment here about Eric, how he's a firefighter and how he has brotherhood with his peers, getting emotional, talking about how he told a friend that he won't die alone. But again, this ends up being the start of the Eric-Yvette relationship on the show, with her talking about how he's a hero and that they're the same from now on, continuously calling him Cappy, which will surely not be said a billion times on this season. I'm also, again, clearly having a final two from very early on in the game. But beyond that, we also get a subplot here revolving around Rachel, with her finding a remote control in the HOH room, with a reveal of it being a spy screen, which we obviously saw in BP5 as well, though an interesting revelation to come from this is the fact that there's also the reveal of a secret room, leading to a massive scavenger hunt sort of sequence of her trying to find the room, clearly being deep in thought in front of the others, where clearly other people were catching on to something being up. But again, it ends up being a lengthy, like heist-like sequence of her trying to get in the room while Sarah's sleeping right next to the door, where once inside, she compares it to Donald Trump's bedroom, which again was a jump scare when I heard that name. But also inside, there are 3 safes that will be opened across the season that surely don't end up underwhelming. But also in there, she ends up finding a key that unlocks the hot tub, which she really ends up making a meal out of this, now revealing to everybody what happened, which I'll say in general, not a great look here for Rachel. I do feel like for Rachel, this is really just showing everyone else how sneaky and how much of a liar you can be. And again, we end up seeing Maggie talk about how this was an innocent decision. Eric talk about how she's calculated, to where again, clearly other players were picking up on this. Anyway, we get to the veto pick, where the veto pick is done the same way it was done in BP5, where the players get to pick who plays, which again, obviously broken, as we'll later see again on this season. But it does feel like they at least attempted to make a slight modification here to stop backdoors, that being the reveal that veto competitions can end with no winner, which is something brought up here never actually happens and is never brought up again, to where again it very much feels like this is a concept that, again, they thought that this was the fix to the back door, where again obviously if no one wins the veto, no one can use the veto to backdoor somebody, so through that obviously makes it harder for you to backdoor a player. The problem is that it's not really hard enough, and again it just never really gets brought up again. There never is a competition where within the rules it mentions how there would not be a winner by the end, to where again ultimately this is a thing that again it feels like a concept that they had created as a counter to the backdoor but never actually properly utilizing, which just leads to it being just as broken as it was last season. But here we do end up getting some focus here around Ashlea trying to find someone who will play for her, with her saying that Howie's her best bet, with him again not agreeing to use the veto on her, but at least agreeing to throw it, to where ends up picking Howie, Rachel ends up picking Maggie, and Kaser ends up picking Eric. A spot where the competition actually has them playing in these pairs, being a competition of them having to untangle rope around this big rectangular cage. Only one of the two end up winning the veto itself, with that being the person that puts the medallion around the goal first, despite them all being connected to the same rope, which again would have been pretty insane to see somebody like steal the veto from their partner, but that ultimately doesn't happen, where it was a competition where it did seem like Eric would have had a big lead here, obviously being a firefighter, though we do see Kaser really shutting down due to the heat, which again seemed to play a major factor here, where you see Ashlea actually being the one to finish first, but without Howie, and decides to just lay down and wait for him, which I assume is due to how tired she is, but again, definitely not a great look here. But ultimately, again, Maggie ends up giving the win here to Rachel winning the veto, and through that, not much suspense, though we do get a weird, like, short red herring of Rachel finding Jennifer in her HOH room and lock the door, to where Rachel gets upset, says that was wrong, and now wants Jennifer out, only for that to not go through and not ever get explained, where we get to the veto ceremony and Rachel doesn't use the veto, and again, none of this ever gets mentioned ever again. But either way, we get to the eviction episode, where we do get some campaigning here, but really none of it really matters. But we see Ashlea campaigning to Howie, with Howie saying that she's eye candy and that she has some great boobies, because that's how Howie talks, and again, most of what he seemingly cares about. But either way, we then see her and Janelle campaign to April about proposing a girls' alliance, though that never seems to come together, where something that is kind of edited out of this first week here is that there seemed to be a very open feud here between Ashley and Janelle and Yvette, where Yvette just seemed to instantly hate them from the offset, talking about how, again, didn't like that Ashley left home at 15, which is like, what does that matter? And it certainly wasn't helped by the fact that James supposedly told Yvette that Janelle was coming for her, which was just a complete lie, which again further sparked that feud. She also ends up making some problematic comments about Kaser, he's lying about his religion and calls him out for not having an accent. Again, all this very weird concept from Yvette that didn't make the show. But either way, we then get a segment here around Michael being a creep where we see him and Jen flirting with him saying your boobs popping out and proceeds to readjust her bikini, which again, weird. We see Eric noticing this and is disturbed, where this ends up really setting up Eric targeting Michael the following round, where again, it really did seem like a lot of it really stemmed from the fact that Michael was weirding out a lot of the women, and through that it led to Eric wanting to take a stand, which, while again, I think you could definitely criticize Eric to a degree in all this and how he handles all this, where it very much comes off as like him being kind of an egomaniac and wanting to be the savior for the women. At the end of the day, again, he is still actually somebody that is taking a stand against sexual harassment. I think that's something to be commended for Eric. So while again, I don't think he necessarily handles things in the right way, I do think he had the right intention in spots like this. But again, it does lead to Kaser here being worried about the guys alliance, where he ends up asking Eric if he should talk to Michael about this, only for Eric to say leave it alone, only for Kaser to do it anyway, and tells Michael to fix it but don't make it obvious, only for Michael to be upset that people are accusing him of things, and proceeds to go straight to Eric, with Eric obviously knowing exactly what happened here, saying that he can't trust Kaser now. But it's really furthering this dissension between this alliance here, and also again just further showing Michael's a terrible player also. But also in this episode, we do end up getting the partner reveal to the audience, where we finally get to see who is paired up with who. First seeing Yvette saying that her and Bo are the twist of the season. They're friends outside the house and no one else has any idea. Only to cut to others talking about how Bo and Yvette clearly know each other. Well, it is really funny how clearly most of the house knew instantly about this twist, where again, the show tries to make it out as this like big surprise. Though again, a lot of people did know what was going on here. While not everybody knew all the pairs right away, most clearly recognized that they weren't the only pair in the game. Where again, we get to Kaser and Michael, who are neighbors and have known each other for 6 years, where we literally see Kaser here saying that they're not the only ones. Where by the end of this week, I mean, Janelle, Ashley, Howie, and Kaser had a conversation pretty openly talking about how, yeah, everyone in this game probably has a pair. But also here we end up seeing Eric and Maggie being friends, with Maggie's boyfriend being a coworker of Eric's, where even here we see Maggie being perceptive, saying that Janelle and Ashley clearly know each other. Clearly by the fact that Janelle is pushing for Ashley to stay, which again, we don't see much of, but also mentions thinking that Rachel and Howie know each other, and also thinks that James and Sarah are married, where we cut to James and Sarah, who are not married, but have been dating for 4 months, where this does lead to a segment about how James and Sarah have to act like strangers. Though I do find the James and Sarah relationship to be, again, a very weird one for the show, one where it felt like a spot where, like, again, James didn't seem like that into Sarah, while Sarah seemed to be really into James, and really just felt very young in how she handled their relationship, being jealous over James flirting, and like constantly want to talk about their relationship over the game, and really just in general, I don't think Sarah is someone that felt built for this game. And to be fair, obviously she was a last second replacement on this cast. She was not meant to be on the season to begin with. And but again, through that, it makes their dynamic on this season very strange, especially because there are points where James talks very negatively about her, which is not a great look. But beyond that, we also get the reveal that Howie and Rachel are friends, which does come off as a very unexpected duo, considering how over the top Howie is and just how normal Rachel is. So where the fact that someone like Rachel would even associate with Howie in the outside world does feel very strange. April and Jen are also sorority sisters, with again it being implied that they're pretty close, when the reality is that they barely knew each other and actually didn't even know each other while they were at the same sorority, and just happened to go to the same sorority, where the reality is that they actually had met while auditioning for another reality show, which is really funny. But also we end up seeing Ashley and Janelle clearly obviously being friends as well, former roommates, with them both also wearing similar outfits, which seems like a pretty massive tell as well. But this does lead to Janelle, again, getting her first of, again, kind of questionable PRs here, talking about how if Ashley goes, it'll just be the young single people versus the old ugly people, and the Latin chick and the gay guy, because she needed to specify that. Where again, it just feels like a spot here where Janelle does talk down the people outside her group in a way that, again, maybe hasn't aged the greatest. And to be fair, that was part of the appeal of Janelle at the time, considering, again, we hated these people as well. But anyway, we get to the eviction, where Janelle ends up voting out Kaser alongside James, which later gets explained as a plan for him and Eric to throw sus onto Michael, which was weird in the sense that, like, again, obviously we know that Kaser and Michael are pair, so like that was never going to turn Kaser against Michael, at least. But beyond that, we do see it being used as a thing people will mention as a reason for why we're going after Michael, and it's why we're, again, just felt kind of contrived as a plan here. So again, I don't think you needed to do this, but ultimately, again, at least nice to see Eric and James playing innovatively to a degree, even though it's also weird considering the fact that, like, Eric was also plotting against James by this point in the game as well. While the show portrays as like Eric and James were pretty close during his first few weeks, Eric never really trusted James and again was plotting with Maggie on how to take James out pretty much from the beginning. But either way, it ends up being a 9-2 Ashley vote, with Howie proceeding to hug Janelle over and over and over again, with Janelle clearly being disgusted here. And again, we see him like proceeding to try to kiss her, which is also again very icky. Again, some very problematic men on this season. But either way, we then get to Ashley's interview, to where we do see her weirdly being told that everybody has a partner in a spot where, considering their later chance to return to the game, I do feel like it was a bit bizarre they told them this. So obviously, again, that implies that they had the plan to reveal this to the others before that point. But it is funny, though, here we do see Ashley saying that hopefully I can come back, with Julie saying you never know, and clearly being surprised by her making that comment. But also, again, all this funny considering Ashley ends up proceeding to leave sequester, not waiting for the chance to come back, which, to be fair, again, she had no chance to come back to begin with. But again, funny how like these are her parting words on this season. But with that, again, we lose Ashley, and I think Ashley is someone that, again, did not bring much to the show. She's probably the most forgettable person on this cast, and also somebody that didn't seem to be too skilled for the game, someone that seemed to be more so there because Janelle wanted to be on the show, and Ashley was just simply her partner for that, where I don't think she had any real vested interest in Big Brother, and it didn't really feel like she cared to really bond with most of the people in the house, and also did not really have any true potential on this season. So again, I think especially in comparison to losing out on Kaser, I do think Ashley was kind of the perfect first boot for this season. But then to move on to week 2, where you get a pretty interesting HOH comp, one that I've always liked, it being a pretty easy Q&A competition, but one that is more so about answering quickly than it is about answering correctly, where obviously if you get it wrong, then you are out, but it's mostly about not being the last to get it right. And I feel like that led to an interesting dynamic with this challenge that sadly gets ruined by BB7 and the buttons malfunctioning there, which leads to it not being brought back again. But again, I thought it was a really fun challenge that ends up leading to a pretty interesting final 2 of Eric versus Janelle, with Janelle ending up answering the final question wrong, giving Eric the win here. But anyway, we start off with pretty sympathetic content for him. Again, him getting pictures of his kids and getting emotional, with Yvette saying that this is the ideal family and that if you don't think love exists, you haven't met Cappy. Only for Janelle to call him out for being an actor, which really starts the trajectory of really almost all of Janelle and Michael's confessionals across this week being very anti-Eric. But we do end up seeing Maggie, again, being a little bit sloppy here, and her proceeding to hug Eric and getting emotional in this moment as well, with James calling out how weird that was and knows that they're now working together. But beyond this, we do get a couple character moments. First from Yvette making a ghetto slide out of trash bags, with Janelle mocking this concept. That again ends up being a notable scene here. Beyond that, we also get a lot of Janelle playing chess, with her playing with some of the men, and we get to hear about her opinions of all of them, which again was good concept for her here. Again, seeing her let James win, so it makes her not look smart. Oh, well, we cut to James calling her dumb but hot, which is pretty James of him. Oh, we then see Michael not being good at all and her putting in checkmate. Oh, well, we see Kaser being calculated, really being the start of their relationship on the show, which obviously ends up becoming an iconic one, even though, to be fair, at this point in the season, she was more so close to Michael than Kaser himself. But beyond this, we also get another segment here, which is another one that ends up being a bad luck for James, with him fighting with Eric over politics, particularly the Iraq war, with James being pro-war and just coming off as a complete idiot here. And again, them having this argument right in front of Kaser, and Kaser just calling him out, which I will say, I don't love this concept that very likely that James and Kaser were cast together here to be these foils for each other, considering and clearly they knew James's takes on the Iraq war. But still, it does lead to a great moment here for Kaser, and him being able to talk about his side of the story, so talking about the civil unrest in Iraq, and again, this being just more great representation that Kaser is able to provide here, which again was especially important during this specific time in U.S. history. But again, weird that we cut from that to a food comp, the Snack Shack from Hell. Again, a gross food eating comp, one that I actually found kind of interesting in the sense as it literally just has them taking normal foods but making puns out of them to make them disgusting. And again, it ends up being a notable segment to me, despite it, again, not really leading to much. But we do get a character moment from the final category being beer, and we see Michael and Janelle stepping up, only for Eric to say, Janelle, step aside, and he's gonna do it himself. Again, leading to this funny dichotomy once again of like Maggie talking about what a leader he is, only for Janelle to be upset at him stealing her spotlight. And this also leads to Eric really struggling to finish it, but again, they do ultimately win by the end. But despite that, it does lead to Eric, again, really just coming off as an egomaniac here. And this obviously being a massive bout of HOH-itis, with Eric really being the epitome of that concept in my mind, of someone who, again, obviously just wins HOH and thinks that they're running the entire game because of it. Where we see him immediately following this calling a house meeting, saying that they win and lose as a team. Also then proceeding to micromanage all their food and when people can eat each food. Also, he'd be the one to turn off the lights at night, saying lights out bitches, which is actually really more funny than anything. But anyway, we end up getting to the real meat of the story of this week, which again comes off very icky in retrospect. The large focus around Michael and him being very weird around Yvette and April, like blowing raspberries on their stomachs, with them being annoyed at this, and again, just very icky behavior. Really grounds for expulsion nowadays, though we do end up seeing April here complain to Eric about him, which I believe this actually happened the previous week. But again, it is what led to the snowball of Michael becoming a bigger target. And again, credit to Eric for standing up against this, actually confronting Michael over this, saying that women aren't feeling comfortable around him, and he calls him out for sexual harassment, how this wouldn't be tolerated in the workplace. And again, I think this is all very good content for Eric. Though Michael's takeaway from all this is that he's upset at Eric for treating him like a perverted pig, and that he's insulted that he used the term sexual harassment, when it's like, that is technically what it is. Where again, he clearly doesn't take any of this in, and it's just being upset at the fact that he's being accused at all, and thinks of this as part of Eric's ego trip, is upset at the women for not telling him this to his face, which again just felt like a very immature outlook on all this. But really, for this entire week, we end up seeing Janelle and Michael just really spend most of their time together in the gold room, not really bothering to interact with the rest of the house. Obviously, further making them pretty easy targets here, but to be fair, they're probably going to be targeted either way, where again, instantly we see Eric plan to put up Michael and Janelle, with him telling Michael that he's a pawn, when in reality he's a target. Obviously, this being a clear breaking of their deal from the previous week, with again the guys alliance the guys alliance already being done by this point. But we do end up seeing Eric though make a deal with Kaser for 1 week of safety, which again Kaser will surely live up to. But again, we see Eric here just kind of openly being upset at Kaser, saying that you broke my trust, and how he's hanging out with the outcasts. And again, at least a problematic moment here of, again, Kaser being pretty calm in responding to this, though Eric saying that don't raise your voice. When it's like, he wasn't raising his voice. But either way, nominations go as expected, where Michael and Janelle end up being put on the block here. Take us to the veto episode, where we get a lot of focus here revolved around Kaser once again, his struggles and being associated with Michael and Janelle, Eric telling him to stay out of it, and Kaser into DR talking about how Eric now looks like a hero for liberating the women, which I feel like was a weird way to phrase all that. But either way, he ends up being annoyed at Michael for spending all of his time with Janelle and not trying to fix his game. Us seeing Janelle being annoyed at Kaser in this moment, after he says that Eric had a great speech, really annoyed at Kaser for just trying to get on Eric's good side, which again, not great gameplay from Janelle. All while a bit weird for their dynamic, where again, Janelle was clearly sus of Kaser during this week, that Kaser sold them out, though obviously Michael ends up repairing that relationship. But really by the end of the week, obviously, Michael specifically tells the two to be working together, which they end up pretty much doing in lockstep. But beyond this, again, we do get a segment here about April having a conversation with Janelle, where again, April's gameplay across this portion of the season goes largely unreported in the edit, though again, it did seem like she was actually one of the better social players on the board, at least attempting to talk to pretty much everybody. And we see her trying to build a relationship with Janelle, though while again she was talking bad about Janelle behind her back and never actually liked Janelle, she at least was attempting to create this game relationship with her, though doing so by trying to throw Michael under the bus and trying to turn it against Michael, with Janelle clearly not buying into that. But this then leads to Janelle saying that everyone is brainwashed by Eric, and if they don't see that, then there are words. That's still being used on TV at this point. But anyway, we then also get a segment about them having to figure out the code to the door to the gym, with Sarah being the one to figure it out. That's the time on the clock in the room, so good for her. Pretty much one of the only things she does early on this season. And it's funny how this is followed up by Maggie ratting out to Eric that Sarah's against him, which where again, not a great look for her by the end. But either way, we also see Eric leading a bodybuilding competition, which is really just an excuse for Howie to be as over the top as you would expect him to be, for Sarah to talk about how hot James is, because sure, I guess. But anyway, now let's talk about the Michael side of the story, where we get so much focus around Michael in this episode. First, around him needing to find a player to play the veto for him, with Kaser saying that he doesn't want to be picked, Michael being upset, saying it's time for action. And obviously, again, this being very bad for Michael's game. Obviously, Kaser's the only person that would be willing to use the veto on him, though obviously that would just, again, blow up Kaser's game. So I think it makes sense why Kaser's not willing to go through this, though. It is a spot here where it feels like the edit is kind of condemning Kaser for not doing this one. I actually do think, again, this is probably the right call. I think for Kaser, it is better for him to just let Michael go at this point, especially because Kaser actually ends up putting in some pretty good work across this week. He really ends up setting up a lot of the pieces to create the Sovereigns, with him and Janelle already having a pretty good relationship with Howie, but him also reaching out to Rachel during this week, then to paying dividends for the following week. But anyway, this leads to the series of fights that we get in the back portion of this week. First with Michael just standing in the kitchen staring at Eric, which is very awkward, leading to Eric saying, "Are you trying to intimidate me?" Michael proceeding to mock his stutter, saying that he got very defensive, is scared, which is like, I mean, again, it would be really weird if someone was just standing in the middle of the kitchen staring at me. But again, we had a lot of content here revolving around how Michael's still upset at the sexual harassment claims, and they think that he's a sexual predator, leading to him in the backyard openly ranting about how people think he's a pervert, asking Jennifer, "Did you know I molested you?" Which is, again, very weird. This is where he starts to refer to Eric as the M-word and calls Yvette ghetto, which all comes off very icky as well. But the real inciting incident ends up being him joking about Eric's dead grandparents, which, why? But Rachel leaking this back to Eric, leading to Eric being pissed off that he's going after his family now. But before we get to that, we get to Michael burping in Yvette's face for no reason. But this does lead to some pretty fun Yvette content, saying that she's going to go Cuban on his ass, which is a clip that was used in her BB7 intro that sticks in my mind. But also we get like a funny moment of her ranting about him to those in hot tub, only for her to then mock his platypus walk with like humorous music playing as she's like imitating it, which is all funny. But anyway, Yvette ends up going to confront Michael, only for Kaser to attempt to defuse the situation, telling Michael to be more mature, and even Janelle agreeing in this spot that he's being very petty, which again, if Janelle is thinking you're petty, I feel like this is a bad sign for what you've been doing. But again, this leads to Michael agreeing that he'll stop, because surely Michael won't get into another fight. But again, as all this is happening, Eric's in the backyard, really riled up over him going after his family, with him and Yvette really just egging each other on what they're going to do to Michael next time they see him, with Kaser then arriving again, trying to calm them down, with both of them coming off very aggressive towards him, with Kaser just constantly asking him like, what did he say, only for him to just not answer him. And this is all while Michael proceeds to walk out into the backyard with Eric staring at him, all while Yvette and Kaser are arguing to the side, with Eric saying stay clear to Kaser, and calling out to Michael that you got a problem, only for Michael to call him the M-word again and say you have a small penis, leading to Eric getting up and having to be held back, with the producers obviously coming on the intercom, separates them, putting them in different rooms, which again, pretty unprecedented. Again, pretty big blowout there, which doesn't stop there, as Kaser and Yvette proceed to now get into a fight, with Kaser clearly being really pissed here in a way that you don't really see from Kaser, which culminates in Yvette saying that you have no respect for women, to where he gets up and they have to be separated as well. Though they do edit out a pretty integral part of this fight in the fact that Yvette ends up calling him a sand N-word, which was really the inciting incident here of why Kaser was so pissed off, to where, again, obviously very problematic for Yvette to be saying that. Again, grounds for expulsion in the modern game. Yet here, again, just not shown on the show. And obviously, again, a very drama-filled segment of the episode. Really a spot where this might be the most tension in the Big Brother house ever. Well, obviously, the rest of the game ends up being this like split house dynamic. I think this is the point where the fighting got, again, very icky, both in what they were saying, but also in the fact that they almost got into an actual fist fight with each other, which again leads to this being a pretty insane series of events. One that I know Michael had to be talked out of leaving here, where again, he wanted to just quit the game at this point. Oh, I know there was a lot of controversy online, particularly around Eric, and how Eric at this point was very much hated by the online fan base, though again was claimed to be getting a very favorable edit, to where there were a lot of claims of favoritism from CBS, and talk about how Eric should have been expelled for how he approached Michael. And beyond that, also again, there's some walkings in the following veto that again led to some controversy there. Again, there was a lot of talk at this point about how people were thinking that the season was rigged for Eric, which again didn't end up being. But once we have everybody being gathered in the living room, given a warning, where we see everyone give their fake apologies, with Eric and Michael pretending to have mended things when in reality they just talk bad about each other behind each other's backs at this point. And ultimately, this didn't really change anything, as Michael's still a goner if he doesn't proceed to win the veto. There still was a lot of tension in the house, just it never really exploded in the way it did here again. But anyway, we get to the veto pick, where we see Eric picking James, where again, while Eric was targeting James at this point, clearly James was one of the better competitors on the board. So again, clearly that was a pick to stop Michael from winning the veto, although we also see Howie and Rachel being picked, with neither of them performing particularly well in a comp that is essentially the first iteration of the slip and slide comp that has become a standard in modern Big Brother, of you transporting water from one side to the other, though instead of sliding down a track, this time they had to use zip lines to go platform to platform. But it ends up being a challenge that's run in heats, with James, Janelle, and Michael winning their heats, which now only being a couple seconds slower than Michael in a challenge that obviously does favor physicality, which obviously started to make people look look at Janelle as a pretty big threat in competitions. But ultimately, both end up losing out to James, starting off his trajectory of becoming the veto king in his first veto win, though a competition, again, had a lot of controversy around it, where supposedly this is a challenge that had to be run twice, where the first time it was run, it was claimed that had just been practice instead of the official run, which led to, again, a lot of this like sketchiness that led to people thinking that the game was rigged for Eric to help Eric out in the game. But either way, veto ceremony, James doesn't use the veto. And at that point, again, it seems like Michael is a goner, though in the eviction episode, we do end up getting a lot of focus here on the majority. Even Eric seeming to question if Michael is the right target, where obviously, again, Janelle showed how good of a competitor she was, almost doing better than Michael in the veto, while also, again, almost winning the HOH. Where, again, it seemed like there was some talk here around taking out Janelle that never really manifested. And again, we do end up getting a pretty lengthy segment here about Janelle and Michael's relationship, showing their very cringy upside-down kiss like Spider-Man, which again, was weird, but also a lot of focus here around how like Janelle, she had a boyfriend that she's cheating on here, and that she ends up breaking up with him in the DR, which is, again, weird that they show this, yet there's no mention on the show of Michael also having a girlfriend coming into the season. And also beyond that, again, not on the show, there ended up being a lot of like slut shaming of Janelle across this week from the opposing side of the house, which, again, not great. Though, to be fair, it's not like Janelle herself is someone that would not say those similar sort of comments back down the road. But also here, we're doing getting a BB5 segment. Again, seeing a lot of the duos from the previous season and what happened to them. And what a shocker that Holly and Jace and Drew and Diane didn't work out. But also we see like Cowboy and Nokomis also not seem to be that close, where we see like Cowboy's wedding and Drew and Scott are the only ones there. Not even Nokomis, which, again, what a great update. So again, that being said, I actually do miss these sort of updates on the show. And obviously, again, it's not that impactful nowadays. Is obviously we have social media to keep up with the players from the previous season, though again, I did like this like idea of this like passing of the torch from the previous season, seeing what happened to the previous season's players and their opinions on the new season. But again, I get why it's not a thing anymore. But ultimately, again, we get to the eviction, where obviously it's a 9-1 Michael vote, where Michael's interview ends up being, again, very awkward, where, again, they tried to make it this like big reveal that everyone had a partner, only for Michael to say it was obvious, where, again, by this point, in Kaser and Michael were pretty open to Janelle, the fact that they were partners, and they had even like told Howie about this to loop him into the group, to where, again, not a surprise in the slightest. But either way, we lose Michael, and Michael's someone that I just find very icky to watch. I mean, he's just such a creepy guy, and again, the way he acts around women was just, again, very weird. And even beyond that, again, he was just like a very awkward guy. Again, his flirting with Janelle was just, again, very cringy to me, and I just did not find him fun TV in the slightest. And it's funny because like I feel like I remember actually liking Michael and feeling bad for him back in the day, when it's like, in retrospect, I don't know why I felt that way. Again, I think in retrospect, he is just somebody that is just very uncomfortable to watch on the show, and also a genuinely terrible player as well, where, again, he just has no real upsides. I think actually rewatching this has made me even further feel like he's probably one of the worst players to ever play Big Brother, and really in general, again, I think he's just a pretty problematic figure that I'm pretty happy ends being kind of a footnote on the season by the end. But then we move on to week 3, probably one of the most iconic weeks in Big Brother history. Pretty much the definitive week where an underdog group was able to come together to usurp the majority, and a week that really solidified my love for Big Brother as a kid. But it all starts off with an HOH, that being Majority Rules, a competition that is completely broken, though always found fun when where essentially you just have to vote with the majority. And obviously, again, there are spots where answer the majority, and obviously, again, if you were to plan this, it makes it broken. But again, they didn't do that at this point, and what do you know? Kaser pulls out the win on the tiebreaker, with him and Janelle and Howie being the only ones clearly happy in a spot where we see Eric saying that Howie's crossed over to the dark side. But again, obviously, big underdog win here for Kaser, a spot where, again, he definitely would have been one of the bigger targets on the board for this week, to where we see him saying that I delivered a crushing blow to the opposition, with Kaser really coming off as this really cerebral player in this spot, saying that he's not focused on vengeance and there's still a game to be played. And to me, again, that also added to the appeal of Kaser as a player on this season, the fact that, again, he was this underdog, the fact that, again, he had this sympathetic background, while also the work that he ends up executing across this week ends up being pretty impressive. But on the offset, he does say that only Janelle and Howie are safe, only for us to cut to Maggie saying that she's not worried about Kaser, as he is bigger fish to fry, which kind of right. But either way, we end up getting a little segment here from Janelle, where they're talking to April, saying that I don't have anyone to hang out with anymore. April saying that I've always liked you, with Janelle giving a very funny response here, saying you do, clearly just not believing her, as again she shouldn't, as April literally proceeded to just tell everyone else that Janelle was begging to be my friend, which is obviously, again, not what happened. Anyway, we get to the HOH room, with Kaser being excited to get his Islamic cut meat, which he doesn't get to eat. And again, this was an entire situation on the live feeds that didn't make the show. But again, someone ended up leaving out his meat to where it went bad, to where again, there was question on if people did it maliciously or not. But again, no, that made the show. But beyond that, we also get a food comp here, being the BB spelling bee, where if you answer correctly, they take a PB&J slice off the wheel, and at the end they spin the wheel to decide on if they have to eat PB&J for the week or not. Really, this was kind of a boring challenge, but one that was kind of funny as it results in them landing on PB&J anyway. Beyond that, we also get a segment around Yvette, where she had been keeping the fact that she's a lesbian secret, where she finally tells April that she has a girlfriend named Maggie, which I love how this is supposed to be, again, obviously a sympathetic moment of her coming out to the house, only for April's first impression to be thinking that this Maggie is the Maggie in the house, and obviously relating it back to the game. But also beyond that, we get a segment around Rachel and Howie's relationship, which is a very strange dynamic, and the fact that they've known each other for 10 years. They made out at New Year's one time, only for Howie to now say that Rachel's over the hill boobies, because that's something a 34-year-old man says. But along with that, we also get the first segment of Howie talking about wanting to be a Jedi, and that he trains 24/7 for it, and pretends like his broom is a lightsaber. And again, a ridiculous sequence that really ends up becoming a major shtick for Howie down the road. But I will say it was kind of humorous, this little moment of Kaser telling him that Jedis don't have sex, and Howie mentioning Anakin, and Kaser said he went to the dark side, which all this is kind of edited in a funny way. But anyway, in terms of the strategy, we do see Kaser instantly attaching himself to Janelle. Obviously beforehand, Michael is really the main thing tying them together, though at this point they're really all each other has. Both of them are the only ones to lose their partner at this point, to where we see Kaser saying that you're my partner now, to where we see them openly talking about how James and Sarah are clearly a couple, that they could use James in the game, to where we do see Kaser approaching James, seemingly wanting to work with him in this spot. Obviously adding him to his alliance would be part of this master plan he has, and again, just wanting James to admit to the fact that him and Sarah are together, only for James to not do that. First up, going off about his previous partner that had to drop out due to medical reasons, which again, he was at least telling the truth in that degree, but then proceeds to pretend that he doesn't know who Sarah is, which again, I just question, like, why lie in this spot? And clearly Kaser knows what's going on here. I don't understand what the point is in pretending. It's just severing this tie that could potentially be built here, and it is a major reason why he ends up going on the block. In a spot where, again, he could have theoretically went home had Dom stayed the same. But it is funny to see Kaser saying, I know that everyone else here has a partner, so why would they leave only 2 people out? When it's like, I mean, they did do a similar thing for BB4. It's like a never say never. Though again, obviously that is a fairly accurate read. And we see Janelle just not trusting James, and for she has every right to, considering how dismissive James is of her. But again, talks about wanting him out of the house, with the plan now being to nominate him alongside Maggie, which again, I do think is a pretty interesting play here. Again, splitting up the other side, as again, Eric will obviously have to choose between the two, which he'll obviously clearly choose Maggie. But again, that would push James further to the side. Obviously, the issue is the fact that, again, it puts James in a lot of danger. If nominations stay the same, very likely James does go home. And through that is probably the only part of this plan that I do question, as I do think on paper, the other side of it is interesting. This idea of really just showing James that Eric is against him. But what does that matter if James ends up accidentally going home? But anyway, we do see Kaser then attempting to pull Sarah in as well, only for Sarah to also pretend like she doesn't know James. Though it does seem a lot more willing to work with Kaser in this spot, again, acknowledging the fact that she doesn't have any alliances, which is kind of insane this late into the game. But again, it seemed pretty clear that she did want to work with Kaser in this spot. It was being held back by the fact that James, again, did not want to reveal their secrets. Again, we do see Kaser actually putting in a good work with Sarah to make them change that. Again, telling Sarah about how Eric and Bo were telling them to put up James and Sarah. Obviously trying to further fracture this alliance, but more so through telling Sarah information that he knows will get back to James, which again, I thought was an interesting play here. But again, James still shuts down the concept of telling Kaser. Instead, tries to make a deal with Kaser to work together, but only if he puts up Janelle, which is so stupid also. Again, why are you doing this? Again, this is a spot where, again, you should know Kaser and Janelle are extremely close, and while obviously most of the house is against Janelle, I mean, Yvette also campaigned against Janelle to Kaser early in the episode, which is also insane. Again, it's still a spot where, like, why would you think he would take the shot against Janelle? Again, I think that is kind of an insane play here. And also for James, again, in a spot where now he does know that Eric is against him, like, why is this your main priority to go after Janelle? I just really don't understand the play here. But either way, we get the nominations. Maggie and James are nominated. Eric's saying he'll make sure that Maggie stays, which he, I guess, technically does. But anyway, we get to episode 8 where we get some focus around Eric going to Kaser, attempting to get Kaser to him play in the veto in a spot where it did seem like originally Eric was fully believing that Kaser was still with him and would have picked him here, which is kind of insane. But ultimately, Eric ends up actually making a deal to not play in the veto, which plays into him not playing in the veto. Also, here we see James being pissed at Kaser, saying that he set him up and that he thought he was going to be working with him, which again, I don't know how you thought that Janelle plan was actually going to work. But at this point, James finally gets his head straight and decides that he should be targeting Eric. Though doesn't think that Kaser will go after Eric because of their deal and is instead going after players closer to him. With, again, it seeming like most of the house thinking that Yvette would have been the back door. And to be fair, I mean, it does seem like that was actually kind of the reality early on, where it did seem like Kaser actually was apprehensive to take out Eric at the beginning of the week, particularly due to their deal. But ultimately, again, comparing notes on Eric and again, James being so gung-ho about wanting to go for Eric ultimately changed that state of mind. But again, we do see James finally realizing that he should be working the other side, saying he needs to turn enemies into friends, with him now talking to Janelle, says that they should backdoor Eric instead of Yvette, calling Eric the dirtiest player in this game, which is funny that that's a thing that he cares about when he's still lying about his relationship with Sarah, when he continues to lie about his relationship with Sarah in this conversation. But eventually Sarah is finally able to get James to agree to just tell them, to where we do see Sarah telling Janelle and James telling Kaser, with Kaser being excited as the alliance that he wanted is now coming together, where now they have the plan to take out Eric and get to the final 6 together. And we proceed to see Kaser fully pulling in the work to secure this alliance, saying he needs Rachel and Howie, proceeding to talk to Rachel, saying he's putting all the pieces together and knows about all the partners, where he reveals there that he knows about her and Howie. Also reveals to her that James and Sarah are dating, which is a surprise to her, with her thinking that they're siblings, with Howie also seeming to believe that as well. But again, they talk about going to the final 6 and allow the best couple win, with the plan now being to get James off the block and take out Eric, to where in that spot they would control the votes. Though again, precarious in the sense that if that veto doesn't work out the way they want it to, James probably goes home. But Rachel gets on board, dubbing him King Kaser, while Kaser ends up saying he's been planning this for 2 weeks and it's finally coming together. Where, again, I think this is something that, again, very impressive for Kaser to actually get this to work. You know, coming into this week being on the bottom and able to come out of this with a 6-person alliance that actually, again, coming out of this week seemed to be sticking together and being able to take out, again, this major linchpin in the game, I think is very impressive play. Now, ultimately, again, Kaser, not the greatest player in the world, and we'll continue to see that beyond this, even going into future seasons. But I do think, again, the play that he has in this week is a very impressive maneuver to pull off, especially considering the very low social capital he had coming into this. Do you think he was able to, again, cultivate this relationship with James and Sarah and Rachel and Howie that was able to get this group to piece together, again, pulling away James and pulling away Rachel from Eric? And again, I think this is all very good play. So again, him piecing all this together, and again, it seeming to be very intentional. But again, on the feeds, he had been putting these pieces together over the last week. Again, to see it actually come to fruition here, again, was pretty satisfying. But ultimately, again, we see Kaser finally pulling in Howie, though obviously Howie's down. Again, Howie and Janelle and Kaser were already alliance at this point, though obviously in Howie fashion, his response to this is to be upset that he can't sleep with Sarah now because she has her boyfriend in the house, because that's something that clearly would have happened. Though I will say something I don't love in retrospect is just how much this alliance really preaches on how clean of a game and honest of a game they're going to play. And it's about where, again, I do think there is a bit of a high horse here with the Sovereigns. And again, there definitely is with the friendship as well, to where, again, it ultimately is just like everyone this season is on a bit of a high horse. But again, it does feel like Kaser, again, despite the fact that, again, he is obviously putting together this massive play here, inside half the house, again, going against his deal with Eric. Again, he's still trying to come off as like the good guy, as like this guy that's trying to play this like clean, honest game. Once again, I would rather you not do that. But ultimately, again, this is the formation of the Sovereign Six. Again, this underdog alliance that comes together in a spot where they were also extremely popular. Again, this is probably the biggest disparity in popularity up to this point in Big Brother between two warring sides. Again, the Sovereigns were just so universally loved, to where obviously we see that play out in a later fan vote. But really outside that, again, the friendship were just so unpopular, with again, the likes of Eric and Yvette just being hated by most of the audience. And again, Kaser and Janelle were these massive fan favorites at this point, to where, again, seeing this move come together, again, the likable people in the house actually being able to pull this move off against these less likable people, again, was such a satisfying aspect of this season. Now, if only it stuck. But anyway, we do get to the veto pick, where you see Maggie picking Yvette's, because Eric made a deal to not play in the veto, and again, he's not going against his word. While Kaser ends up picking Howie, and James picks Janelle, which is obviously a big blow to the opposing side. James saying he's going to use their worst nightmare against them, with Yvette saying that she wanted to beat James up, and Eric obviously now being very worried, or you could even see on his face just the fact that he clearly senses something is up in this spot, as again, why would James pick Janelle? But again, we get to the veto competition, an iconic competition here, it being Night Moves, obviously a modification of a challenge that we've seen on Survivor, where you move along a board and flip over pieces as you stand on them, where no one can stand on them again, and the last person that's able to make a move ends up winning. Though in this game, the modification to it is that you can only move in the shape of a knight, which again, fun, iconic competition here, technically broken, especially in the way that we see play out right now, where again, plays out in a way that again makes for great TV, and I think this is one of the best moments in the history of Big, and I think this entire sequence is one of the best moments in the history of Big Brother, but also a spot where, again, it really just allows the majority in the competition to just make sure that the minority loses, where here we do see James, Kaser, and Janelle all gang up on Maggie and Yvette, making them the first two outs, in a spot where also really funny that Howie just seemed to not know what was going on here and just seemed to be playing his own game. But also, again, we get such great editing throughout the sequence. Again, this really epic music playing as Maggie runs out of moves and Eric shaking his head on the side, with Eric calling them the evil empire, but ultimately they all throw the competition to James. James getting his second veto win of the season, with obviously this entire plan working out perfectly. So what makes this entire sequence even better is the aftermath here, where obviously, again, the opposing side clearly knows what happened here. They clearly just gave the win to James, where we get this iconic conversation between Maggie and Kaser, where Maggie pulls him over and tells him that the game just got nasty, and that she's upset that she's the target, and that you sealed my fate. Only for Kaser to say, no, I sealed your partner's fates, which obviously, again, iconic line, one of the most iconic lines in Big Brother history, such a badass line also. Again, this does so much, obviously revealing that he knows about her partner, showing him have like a full scope of what's going on in this game, also revealing to her this bigger elaborate plan that is happening, also directly telling her that, hey, your number one ally is going home. And again, I think this one line here is just so iconic, though interestingly it's followed up by him saying that I caught the bigger fish, which again might not be proven right. Now ultimately I do think Eric is obviously the one that in the game at this point that had the most influence. He was a lot more of the reason why that other side was put together, and obviously again Maggie ends up picking up the scraps and ends up doing very well with that. Though I do think you can question again if this was the right move here to take out Eric in a spot where Maggie is probably the better player. Though to be fair, at this point I do think Eric was no slouch, and again definitely had a lot of influence in this game that made him also a pretty ripe target. But yeah, I love the aftermath of this where Maggie just walks away just saying amazing over and over again. Though again, she ends up coming off on a high horse here, saying that Kaser's willing to do things that she wasn't willing to do to win this game, and he has to live with his decisions. Because again, Maggie will certainly not go against any deals ever in Big Brother. But again, this ends up leading to Eric, again, also obviously knowing what's going on here, confronting Kaser as well, knowing that he threw it, and says, tell me you didn't take it, only for Kaser to say that I can't do that. It says, tell me that you're planning on putting me up. He says, that's my pick, which again, kind of a funny way to just tell Eric that, yeah, you're going home. But it does lead to Eric again trying to use Kaser's religion against him, saying that that's not in the Quran anywhere, only for Kaser to say that you're a dirty player. And we have Eric barging into the house, telling the others he's going up, proceeds to take his hat that James is wearing off his head as he walks away, leading him bickering with James at this point, with James calling him out for lying to him, saying the other group is the only one willing to save him, while Eric continues to talk about the Quran and ends up calling out Sarah by the end of this, saying, I know that you're with James. With again Maggie and Yvette trying to calm him down, talking about how he's been exposing a lot of information. It's like, again, this should have been very clear this was the thing. I don't know how it's actually remained as secret as it did. But it does lead to a bit of a humorous scene following this of Yvette sobbing, being upset that they didn't get rid of Kaser in week 1, and how stupid are they that got rid of Ashlea because she was annoying. Only for Eric to say, don't take the game personally, because Eric will never take this game personally. Ultimately, again, we quickly get to the veto ceremony where James ends up using the veto on himself, with Eric obviously being the renom. He gets to the eviction episode where, again, some bitterness here from Eric that was fun to see, where we see Sarah trying to console him, only for Eric to tell her to give him the respect and not shit in his ear and tell him it's raining, where he ends up shooing her away there, where we do also end up seeing Eric and Maggie kind of spiraling here, thinking that the entire house was in on it, with him even saying, Yvette, please tell me you had nothing to do with this, where, again, I don't know if Yvette would have had the ability to be in on this, but she ends up saying that people are being nasty and that she thought it was only Janelle, but now it's others too, because clearly Janelle was the only source of negativity on this season. So we see Eric and Maggie obviously coming to terms with the fact that one of them is going, though also one of them is staying, and whoever ends up staying still is in a pretty decent spot in the game, still being the leader of this pretty sizable alliance. Though this ends up being a spot where, again, Maggie does seem pretty resigned with going home, where we don't really see her campaigning to stay and actively not wanting to stay. We even see her saying in the DR that she's willing to sacrifice her game to keep Eric around. Seemingly actually thinking that Eric will stay, which, I mean, to be fair, Eric does have 4 votes and just needs 1 more, but ultimately, again, very tough for him to actually get that. Oh, we do end up cutting to the Sovereigns, really debating between the two, where obviously they have all the power in this spot, where, again, there's talk about how Maggie is a smarter player, and the vote never really seemed to change from their perspective, where it felt like Eric was always going home, though it did feel like they were at least trying to pretend to the other side that they were going to switch. But again, it ultimately ends up being a 5-4 vote, with Yvette and Bo ending up voting to save Eric, and to be fair, that was never changing. But also, April and Jen end up voting to save Eric in a spot where this is interesting because they were actually not meant to be voting out Eric, where they had even made a deal with the Sovereigns for 2 weeks of safety if they did side with them, only for him to just not do that and put their votes onto Maggie because of James, where a really underreported story is just how much April and James did not get along, and April was really upset over how James flipped to the other side, and despite them also making a deal with the other side to take out Eric, they do refuse to end up going through that deal because of how much they dislike James. Where I would say, just in general, I think that is probably one of the bigger downsides of this overall move. Again, while it's a very impressive move to be putting together, again, one that really disrupts the power structure of the house, I don't think it does so enough. And I think it's a spot where, while they at least attempted to pull over Jen and April, and again, if they were actually able to get them fully on their side, this would have been an even more impressive move. Ultimately, they were never really able to get April and Jen to separate from the Maggie-Eric side of things, which again, leaves them in a spot where they're near even numbers coming to the following round, which is, again, not ideal, especially with a very bad HOH result, which might happen. Either way, beyond that, as with typical eviction episodes at this point, we do get a segment about Janelle and Kaiser's families. Also, we do get another scavenger hunt sequence here of them noticing that the coasters are gone, leading to them finding a clue in the fish tank, leading to a number for one of the safes in the gold room. It's like, who really cares? Again, this really doesn't lead to anything. But an interesting segment here comes from the fact that at this point, obviously, most of the partnerships are very public, to the point where the entire cast gathers together to reveal their secrets. With, again, you would assume that this would be about the partnerships, but instead, James just openly admits to the fact that he's not a teacher and that he's 29 when he previously said he's 27, which is like, why did you admit to that? And this really feels like the spot where, like, James just felt like he needed to gloat about how much he lied. And again, I think it's probably fine to tell this to your alliance, but again, for him to just openly say this, just like, again, makes him come off even less trustworthy as, again, someone that's just a pathological liar. But either way, we see pairings admit to knowing each other, with Yvette being shocked to hear that everyone had a pair, because clearly the entire twist was revolved around her. But despite all this, we see Yvette and Bo and April and Jen still lie about not knowing each other, where we see Yvette acting very emotional here over not having someone she's playing for. So again, Howie clearly doesn't believe it here, even though, again, there was technically precedent for this in the past, but still just ends up being kind of a dodo moment for Yvette. Always see April and Jen decide to admit to the others, specifically wanting to do so before Yvette and Bo, to, again, kind of throw them under the bus. Where I love the way they reveal this is by Jen saying, "I barely know this bitch." Or they do say that they've only seen each other once or twice, and I find it very funny. The show portrays this as a lie when I believe this is actually the truth. Though again, it very much comes off as them trying to downplay their relationship. But while Yvette says that her and Bo were just put together, saying that she's only going to tell them half the story, this does lead to a funny moment here of Eric realizing, again, the reason why they might be put together and the fact that they're both gay. Into the very iconic Yvette confessional with it saying she's gay in the Chiron, which again, kind of insane that Big Brother did this. But this all culminates in Julie revealing to the players herself everyone entered the house with a secret partner, but also into telling them about the money incentive as well, which, to be fair, you would expect them to do. But I did question the intentionality of when they were actually going to reveal this. Did they only reveal this now because everyone already figured it out, or was there plans elsewhere to reveal it in a different way? I do question that. And while obviously it was very obvious, I don't know if I love the fact that, like, production makes this official, especially officially telling them about the money, where again, that just further puts in this bigger target on the duo's backs by the end of the game. To be fair, at that point, also there's further incentive in the fact that obviously you know that they're further incentivized to be working together because they could potentially get this $1 million prize. Ultimately, again, just further puts a target on the duo's back. It felt pretty impossible for any of them to actually get to the end at this point unless they just won out. But anyway, we get to the eviction where Eric is evicted in the 5-4 vote. In his activity, they think they got rid of the stronger player, but they underestimated Maggie. Again, I guess unless he gets proven right. But again, with that, we lose Eric. And Eric's someone that I have kind of conflicting messages with, where I do think Eric is someone that, in retrospect, again, from a modern day lens, isn't that bad. I mean, I think he's someone that you kind of remember as being this like massive dick, potentially problematic. But again, he's actually probably one of the least problematic players on this season, especially of the men, where well, obviously, yeah, he is a control freak. And again, he does come off very hypocritical at points and doesn't really own up to his game. I think in retrospect, he's someone that has kind of aged relatively well, and someone that I actually don't think is a terrible player. I mean, he is obviously very hot-headed and can get himself into trouble, but I do think in a world where he isn't taken out in this spot, where again, this very difficult maneuver to pull over and putting together the Sovereign 6 and able to get Eric out in a 5-4 vote. I think if it was not for that, Eric's in a pretty decent spot at this point, where obviously I think Maggie by the end is probably the more skilled player. Eric was in the position that Maggie ends up being in at this point. Again, having this undying loyalty from Yvette and Bo and having these connections to April and Jen, I do feel like Eric is someone that had Maggie gone in this spot instead of Eric, I think there's still a serious shot that he's able to really steamroll the rest of the season. I do think he's a player here that really gets sniped out of the game in a spot where he had so much potential if he stayed. Now, again, I think he's still very questionable as a player, very hot-headed, very overbearing. Again, it would not be a shocker if he does eventually have his own allies turn against him. But again, I think there were some impressive aspects of his game. The fact that he was willing to make these deals and go back on them. And well, ultimately, again, it would have been nice if he actually owned up to that. Ultimately, again, I think Eric is a player here that, for me in retrospect, actually comes off a lot better the way he did at the time. To where ultimately, again, while I obviously was rooting for Kaser to beat him, and I still think it leads to one of the greatest weeks in Big Brother history where Eric goes, I do think Eric himself is probably somebody that isn't as hateable on the rewatch, especially compared to certain other people from this season. But now for week 4, which as a follow-up to week 3 was certainly a letdown. And again, being a massive Kaser fan, I remember being devastated by the end of this week. But again, continuing this shifting power structure where we do get to the HOH, it being a basic carnival comp, with them rolling a ball down the track and the closest to the hole without falling in ends up winning. But again, it being really tense with there being these clear 2 divided sides. And we do see Janelle in the lead for the majority of it until Maggie's turn where she takes the lead. But even at that point, we still have Rachel and Sarah left to go, only for both of them to fail as well, with us getting a lot of focus here around Sarah blaming herself for their loss and letting down the team. But again, Maggie wins HOH, which was, again, just so devastating as a kid. It was so clear that Kaser was so screwed in this spot. And to be fair, probably was not as screwed as I thought he was, as again, obviously there's at least a certain other option to go home. But again, seeing the friendship side win power during this week was just such a blow to my enjoyment of the season at the time. But either way, we do get some of the reaction to the Eric eviction, with James mocking Eric, saying he's now watching from home, saying, "Hi, Eric." Oh, well, Yvette is wearing Eric's clothes, talking about wanting to win the money and buy Cappy a BMW, which has Maggie and Yvette saying they're going to do what Cappy wanted, and they're both playing for Cappy, which, again, I do think leads to some questionable intentionality on Maggie's part, where I think in the modern day, a lot of people look at Maggie as this like cult leader that was intentionally using Eric's blind side as a way to cultivate her group, which, I mean, like, to a degree that is correct. But again, I do think it was not intentional in how she did so. Again, I think she genuinely was really bitter over how Eric left and legitimately did want to keep her group together to get revenge for Eric. To where, again, I really don't feel like Maggie is doing this based around game reasons and is more just doing this because she genuinely just hates the other side for getting rid of Eric. But anyway, we do see her HOH room where we get a lot of content here revolving around James saying that the rats are kissing Maggie's ass and it makes him sick, where this is week where you get a lot of focus around James' vitriol for Maggie, of them again just never getting on the same page. But we do see James really attempting to play both sides during this week and talking to Maggie, Yvette, and Bo. Again, we do see a very awkward conversation here between James and Maggie, with Maggie really just not believing a single thing he's saying, with James, again, getting some questionable content here, saying that he wants to smack her and that she's the most dishonest player here, but proceeds to then throw Sarah under the bus. But he does end up like largely blaming her for him flipping, and so very openly talking about how he's okay for going home, which again, he has clarified after the fact that he was doing this to like lessen the target on them and make them look separated, though again, it never really came off as believable. But really Maggie and their conversations really ends up giving him nothing. Oh, well, he himself is, again, very apprehensive to say any names. Well, this leads to him being annoyed at how he can't read her and that he thinks that she's a cop, which ultimately ends up being unfounded. But again, as much of a gamer as James seems to be, you would think he would actually respect this from Maggie, but instead it seems to lead to him hating her even more, ending up being one of the most anti-Maggie presences across the entire season. But also we later see Sarah have a one-on-one with Maggie as well, in which she ends up being a bit sloppy here, more openly throwing out names, throwing out Howie and Rachel in particular. Obviously doing this in an attempt to save James, but ultimately all this really does just add ammunition to be used against them for down the road, especially when it's all paired with Maggie making a deal with Howie and Rachel, making a deal for safety. Also, we see her coming off very perceptive and noticing that Howie's turning to Rachel for answers, which again just further increases the target on Rachel's back. But beyond that, we do get some segments around Howie and how he's obsessed with boobies, because I never would have guessed that. But also we see some focus on his relationship with Bo that also doesn't lead to anything. We get a segment for Yvette about how creative she is and that she makes food using their PB&J supplies, which is pretty boring, but it's all lead up to the food comp, which is the match game with panelists dressed in ridiculous outfits to be like the old school match game. Though a dumb aspect of this challenge is the fact that you only need to match 2 answers, and considering there are 4 panelists, the players clearly just break it here by the panelists essentially pair up and answer the same way, giving them essentially the opportunity to answer 2 of the most obvious answers and still get it correct, to where again they do end up easily winning here. But also along with that, they end up winning the remaining numbers for one of the safes in the gold room, which has PB&J inside, which is really lame. Though inside the PB&J sandwiches is a PB&J pass that one of them randomly gets, and Janelle gets it. Who would have guessed? And the first of many times she gets very lucky on the season, and also a spot where who cares? But anyway, we see Janelle expecting Kaser and James noms with her as the replacement, with Kaser saying that it took him 2 weeks to put this group together and he can't see it falling apart because that's certainly something that won't happen. Where again, we get the nominations, and again, it's the expected of James and Kaser as the noms, with again, it being a similar move to last week's of again nominating 2 sides of this big alliance, which will essentially cause this alliance to turn against each other. Though I do question how intentional that part of it necessarily was, as again, it does feel like they were mostly just nominated because they were the ones most responsible for the Eric eviction. And we do end up seeing the Sovereigns really take this very emotionally. Again, look at it fully as just a move made for revenge that they don't think for themselves. When it's like, again, also like, what did you want Maggie to do? That would make sense, though. Either way, Kaser ends up saying that this will lead to the most competitive competition in Big Brother history. I guess, but and it takes us to the veto episode, where we do start off with Sarah being very emotional here after having pulled the final key and seeing that started off a JA, only for it to obviously be Janelle instead of James, which did feel like them messing with Sarah. Though again, technically the friendship never actually mentioned that's something they were doing. But again, we get a lot of focus here around the Sarah James relationship, with him saying that she's the world to him, even though again he seemed to not be that into her, and ends up saying that if he picks her for veto, he's guaranteed a loss and that she'll blame herself, which again was definitely a very questionable outlook for their relationship. But either way, we see Janelle saying that she's going to fight like hell to get Kaser off the block. And also saying that if Sarah is the replacement, that they actually would vote out Sarah over James in this spot, which, to be fair, again, probably the correct move. While James is obviously a very sketchy figure that is very tough to trust, at the end of the day, probably the correct call. Again, Sarah's probably the lesser player of the Sovereigns at this point, and James is someone that you could definitely use as a weapon against the other side. But I'm also thinking that they have the votes, but technically to do so, they would need 1 vote from the friendship. They do not have the numbers themselves to get that vote through, because they think they have Yvette as a number to keep James, which largely stems from the fact that James and Yvette were extremely close in the game, with both kind of keeping each other around as this like secondary option for them. Which actually ends up probably being one of the best things that Yvette does in the game, is again having James as his parachute, which again she doesn't use to the best effect, but I do think it shows some good work from her at points across the season. But that's followed up by more content about how Yvette's upset that Cappy's gone, and that the bad guys get everything and the good guys walked out the door, that no one deserves it more than Cappy. But it's also during this week where we obviously get the formal formation of the Friendship Alliance, with it being named on the show at this point, which again is probably one of the most hated alliances in Big Brother history. Again, a spot where there was near universal disdain for this group. So I do think in retrospect, I don't actually see that big of a difference between the Sovereigns and the Friendship, outside the fact that obviously just the Sovereigns are much better TV, where really I think both sides end up being on a massive high horse, thinking of themselves as the good people. And that's a notion that I think, again, did come off annoying with the Friendship at the time, but I do think rewatching the season, you do kind of notice a lot of the Sovereigns as well. But something to note here is also there was supposedly an added notion of why people did not like the friendship, at least from the online community, and the fact that they did say some pretty terrible things in the HOH room where James had convinced them that the HOH cameras weren't on the live feeds. There, they end up revealing a lot of really dirty secrets about their real lives that made them just, again, further come off as pretty horrible people. That, I'll be honest, again, in the research for this video, I wasn't able to find any live feed archives of this actually happening. So I know it is a story that is passed around as time goes on. I know James himself has confirmed that, yes, he did do this. Though, to be fair, those things weren't really necessary to make them come off not likable, as, again, most of the actual people that watched the show did not know that this happened, and they were still extremely unlikable. To where, again, it's just the friendship were never really popular to begin with. But again, we do see James again trying to play both sides. Though it is in his conversation with Yvette that we do get probably one of the biggest moments of the entire season, a moment that really ends up continuing this downward trajectory for the Sovereigns as time goes on, and that we do see James with Yvette swear on the Bible that he would put up Howie and Rachel, which I really do question, why did you do this? Now, again, I get the fact that, again, he was at this point wanting to work more so with Janelle and Kaser. Howie and Rachel were people that he was not as close to within the Sovereigns, and or also this other pairing that could easily throw under the bus. So I get that. However, the thing I don't get about this is, first, why'd you swear on the Bible? Again, I think that was just so unnecessary. But also, why did you now decide to throw out names? Where, again, it is funny that in his conversation with Maggie, he's so apprehensive to really say any name, yet here he just so willingly throws Howie and Rachel under a bus, which obviously gets back to him, which obviously ends up becoming the catalyst for what happens the following round. Now, while the friendship were looked at as, again, a very solid group, and ultimately, again, do stick to each other for most of the season, the reality is, again, at this point in the season, it was not really as solid. It was really more so a group of like Maggie, Yvette, and Bo, with April and Jen kind of like hanging on the side where, again, they were still in the spot where they were trying to play both sides, claiming to the others they were not with the friendship. So ultimately, again, they do stay loyal to the friendship and were viewed as part of the opposing side. They at least were, again, in that kind of James spot of at least trying to make connections to kind of play the middle. But anyway, we do eventually get to the veto pick where Maggie ends up picking Bo, and really outside that, it's the typical picks. Kaser picks Janelle, James picks Sarah, to which ends up being a pretty interesting veto comp of them sitting on a spinning couch and throwing balls at their TV, having to hit the right buttons to turn the TV to channel 5. A comp that really makes it so easy for pairs to just back the one that's not on the block and give both safety, which in that sense, maybe a little broken. Though really funny, this challenge went by super quick to the point where it really felt like they had to drag it out as much as possible for the show, with James almost single-handedly winning the challenge for Sarah in what would have been his third veto win in a row, which already by this point would be a record. But in doing so, obviously this further dooms Kaser, where, again, I think his only chance of staying this week was the shot landing on James, which, again, there was at least a chance of that. But at this point where James has the veto, really Kaser was so doomed. But this is obviously just ending up leading to a pretty obvious result. But it is funny that after this veto, James just completely changes his tune, essentially goes back on his word already about the Howie and Rachel thing, and tells her that he wants to target Maggie instead, which, again, why are you doing this? Like, I really just don't understand this play from James, where, again, you're telling Yvette, who is someone that is so obviously very close to Maggie, that you want to take a shot at her essentially number one ally, while also now showing that you went back on your word when we swore in the Bible, to where, again, just none of this makes any sense. And it does lead to Yvette telling the friendship, which just furthers the target on James's back. But beyond that, we also see that it's April's birthday, and she gets a party from Kmart. Funny, but also gets a card from her husband and her dog Pepperoni, which we definitely won't be mentioning Pepperoni ever again. We also see them being sponsored by a movie, Four Brothers, which feels like a very random movie to sponsor Big Brother, but that ends up being a random draw to give out a pass, with Howie getting in, proceeds to just give it to Jen for brownie points, I guess. But then there's an actual competition for the final spots for the movie, which has them gathering light bulbs and transferring them from one side to the other and revealing a message, and it was all just really boring. I really don't care who wins, but they get to watch a movie, so that's something. But as for the actual renom, we do see Yvette instantly saying that she wants Janelle out, with, again, just Janelle just being the very easy renom, especially in a spot where, again, Sarah and James are now both immune. You made a deal with Howie and Rachel. Again, there really isn't many other options. But Yvette does actually seem to want to vote out Janelle in this spot, though that does get shut down. But this does lead to a segment from Maggie talking about how she'll do whatever the friendship wants, and that they're making decisions as a team, where, again, this is another spot where I just further don't think Maggie's game is particularly intentional. Again, a lot of people talk about her as this cult leader. She's, even in her own confessionals is saying that she's not. Again, I think she is just truly doing what she feels is best for the friendship, to where while obviously, again, that is guided under her own biases and is in a way that is benefiting her game, I don't feel like this modern perception of Maggie, of her being this cult leader that really dominated the game, is a particularly accurate one. But it is here where we see Kaser at least attempt to put together a campaign, trying to get Maggie to put up Jen, where again, at this point, Jen and April were on the outskirts of the alliance. So again, Maggie just gives him nothing. And we do have Kaser leaving the conversation saying that he thinks it's a 50-50 that she'll take the offer, which is like, I mean, spoiler alert, they don't take the offer. And obviously we get to the veto ceremony where Sarah uses on James and Janelle is the renom. So really the only suspense coming to the eviction is, again, this notion that the friendship might potentially take out Janelle, where Maggie says it'd be funny if we voted for Janelle while the other alliance votes Kaser, but ultimately, again, doesn't really seem to work. But again, we do see Kaser going on a campaign here to April that ultimately leads to nothing, outside of April revealing to Kaser that his own people have been throwing his team under the bus. With Kaser obviously clearly knowing she's talking about James, leading to Kaser warning Howie and Rachel that James is flipped, which ultimately this fully ends up destroying the alliance, as this leads to what happens the following week. Which again, like, I get the notion of not trusting James anymore, but I think just outwardly targeting him is just so idiotic in a game that has a split house dynamic here, where at least James is someone that is willing to work with you. And again, you know that James is a very self-interested player. And again, he knows that there is no loyalty to him within the friendship side, where, again, I just think it's such an idiotic move to actually want to target James at this spot when you have this very powerful opposing side against you. This ultimately leads to, by the end of this week, pretty much the entire house wanting James out, which again is a move that just only helps the friendship. But it does lead to Kaser going on an anti-James campaign at this point, telling them to keep him around so he can go after James. And if he stays, he could do really well in this game, because that's something Kaser's known for. But beyond that, we get another segment about how upset Maggie and Yvette are without Cappy, only for the Sovereigns to obviously mock that, where I did find this moment really funny of a flashback to Yvette literally yelling, "Where's Cappy?" during the food comp, only for James to respond with, "Just pick a word, dumbass." Well, we proceed to see them all like getting on their knees and just like mocking Eric's stature while yelling "Maggie, no," which is all just very over the top and ridiculous. But at the same time here, we do see James also attempting to get Kaser to target Maggie if he stays. So it's in a spot where Kaser just proceeds to say that she's not a threat, but James ends up calling her Mini Eric, with us cutting to her wearing his clothes and clearly taking over his role, with again James being very gung-ho on wanting to target Maggie, while the others seem to still just look at her as a minion for Eric that's just following her orders, which again, I think the reality is kind of just a mix of the two. Here we also get a segment about James and Sarah's families. Finally see Sarah's family being upset at how critical he is of her, which again, definitely not a great sign for their relationship. But either way, we get to the eviction where it's obviously a 7-1 vote for Kaser, with James being the only one to vote out Janelle, thus getting the pretty iconic "What up, Kaser" chant as he ends up leaving. But it is after he leaves that we get the reveal of another twist. The reveal that an evicted player will be returning to the game. That it's America's choice on who does so, where obviously this very much softened the blow for Kaser's eviction here. Though a spot where obviously this was planned the entire time. Again, they were hinting back in week 1 that this twist was going to happen. Obviously, they had to keep these people sequestered, so it's not like a spot where they just threw this in at the last second to save Kaser. Though we do learn right away that Ashlea had left sequester, where she won't be involved in this, which I've heard like conflicting reports on what exactly happened here. There were some people that say that she had a sick family member that led to her leaving, and while I see other people say that she got caught sneaking out sequestered, where again, I don't know what the reality is, but either way, she's not eligible to come back, with it just being a vote between Michael, Eric, and Kaser, where again, now knowing the massive popularity for the Sovereigns and Kaser in particular, again, it made it pretty clear who was going to win that vote. Even though again, as a kid, I did not know this, and because that, again, I was very much rooting for Kaser in this spot, but again, not knowing how popular he was very worried that we might get an Eric return instead. Though I do find it very interesting that players were openly told that this is happening, which is a spot where again, this should have very much influenced the strategy of the following week, as especially in a split house dynamic where again, knowing that the other side might get a number back the following week should have made it even more important to be keeping your side together and not targeting your own side, which again, insane that it happens anyway. And now for week 5, the week where really just everything goes to shit for the Sovereigns, where it does start off decently well in the fact that we do get the HOH Eliminator, a basic Q&A where if you get the answer correct, you can eliminate another player. Again, a challenge I've always liked, obviously exposes social dynamics here. Though to be fair, on most given situations does give the majority an advantage, though here, again, with 2 split sides against each other, it does lead to a lot more intrigue, and obviously, and we do see the Sovereigns really dominate this challenge with only Yvette of the friendship getting a question right, and through that taking James out, though outside of that, we do see Sarah getting a couple questions right, eliminating Jen and Yvette, which you would think through that would be good enough to prove James and Sarah's loyalties, but no. But either way, Howie and Rachel get the last few questions right, with Rachel ultimately throwing the final question to Howie, which she will certainly regret, in a spot where, again, the game would have been so radically different had she just not done that. But either way, Howie is the HOH here, yelling out Super Bowl, baby, which he definitely doesn't do a billion times on this season. But it's funny seeing James here being happy that he doesn't have to compete to save himself this week, only for Howie to be upset at James for saying his name, saying that he shot himself in the foot, which was certainly a bad sign here. But before we get to that, we do get some more wackier segments. We get Howie's HOH room, where we see him hoping for a lightsaber and being upset that he doesn't get one, which we'll get to that eventually. Oh, we also get a food comp with us getting some fun from Janelle picking a team filled with friendship members so that she could throw the competition, because she has a PB&J pass, so she doesn't really care if she wins or not. The competition has them eating bakery off of a conveyor and eating as much as possible, with Janelle just funnily smashing food in her face, pretending to be eating, but never actually consuming anything, putting her entire team on PB&J except for her. Now, beyond that, we also get some segments around April, which were not the most flattering. I mean, first, a very weird segment about how she has a tail and everyone touches it and freaks out. Well, we also get a segment about her smoking, and a spot where she says that she doesn't smoke, but brought in 3 cartons of cigarettes. But again, she's certainly not a smoker, to which she ends up running out here and ends up begging in the DR for more, but ultimately doesn't get it. But as for the strategy of the round, it does start with Janelle talking about how Eric coming back could be a big problem for them, with again it feeling like the Sovereigns should be solidified here and taking a shot at probably Maggie in particular to make sure that Maggie and Eric aren't back together, with the initial plan here being to put up Maggie alongside April, only for Howie to talk about wanting to get rid of James, saying that James is the most dominant player in Big Brother history for some reason, only for Janelle and Rachel to say no here, and that they have to get rid of Maggie first, particularly due to Eric coming back, which again is the sane decision to make there. Now, ultimately, again, they really should be doing it either way. It actually doesn't really matter if Eric is coming back or not, as you should be taking a shot at the other side over James, but this just makes it even more idiotic if you don't do so. But again, they're actually not really thinking about this properly, even in this case, where they're really thinking about it more so that if we keep James around, he'll be a shield for us in the case that Eric comes back, as Eric will be more focused on taking out James, which again is a fair argument, definitely a benefit to all this, but it's also like them just kind of neglecting the fact that the other players also have to deal with James eventually. Though with that said, Rachel ends up being largely uninvolved in a lot of the later game talks, where obviously Howie ends up having some one-on-ones. We have some conversations with Howie and Janelle, both there. However, Rachel herself ends up being largely disconnected from all this, which to her is a major negative. It's a spot where, again, it seemed like she was too complacent and just assumed that Howie would do what was logical. But again, it's Howie. So while, again, obviously Rachel has the right state of mind in this spot, at least, again, on paper, I do very much fault her for not managing Howie correctly in the lead up to the nomination. But and we end up seeing Howie talking to April and Jen, with April and Jen at this point again fully navigating through the game as a pair, and actually do some pretty impressive work here, spreading James's lies to them, with April talking about all the shit James said about him. Say if they get rid of James, it won't be a divided house, which is such a ridiculous argument, as that really just further solidifies the divisions, as now all you have to target is the other side. They ultimately end up making a deal with Howie that if he takes out James, then they'll take out Sarah next, with Howie then proceeding to have a conversation with James, where he proceeds to tell James about this, the fact that the other side's gunning for him, which does make James comfortable here, as again, why is Howie telling him this unless he was with him, which is again certainly the question. But obviously a big moment here that I think largely gets remembered more so in the years since is this conversation between Maggie and Howie, where again Maggie does some pretty good work here, making a deal with Howie to keep him safe in the case that Eric comes back, fully getting him to agree to put up James and Sarah. Probably the most impressive individual move Maggie does in the game, though again I think a spot where again I think Maggie probably gets a bit too much credit for like the sole implementation of this move, where I think a lot of people do talk about this move as a solely Maggie move, when again it was definitely April and Jen putting in work into this as well. It's a move that again does put her in a pretty good spot to go on to win the game, at least on paper, where again it essentially hands the friendship the numbers coming into the jury phase while completely disrupting the sovereign power structure that, again, just puts Maggie in an incredible spot, but also obviously just a completely terrible move for Howie, one that essentially, again, dooms the sovereigns unless they're in the final two against each other, where otherwise the friendship will have the majority on the jury, meaning that essentially the friendship contingent will be deciding the winner of this season, while also, again, leaving Howie vulnerable for the short term, where at this point it really is just him, Rachel, and Janelle, and it's about where, while again you can't trust James was still a person that, again, was riding the middle. He definitely would have worked with you in certain situations over, again, the opposition that simply wouldn't after James is gone. So again, this ends up being talked about as one of the dumbest moves in Big Brother history, and to be fair, it's certainly up there. But I think worse moves are probably more directly tied to a specific person directly losing the game from that, where, again, Howie is technically still in it for the long haul after this and not in any danger for a while, but it does like fully sink his entire alliance to have almost no real chance at winning the game at this point. Where again, it is certainly a terrible move here. But again, this is all done without the guidance of Rachel, where Rachel finally finds out about all this later, the fact that Howie made all these deals to take out James, to the point now where going against these deals would obviously cause pretty big issues for them, to where at this point we do see Rachel saying that she didn't think he'd do something this dumb, but now has her thinking that she's screwed either way, where obviously if they make this move, then the Sovereigns are obviously again completely outnumbered and lose James and Sarah. However, if they don't make this move, then they have the other side directly coming for them at this point, instead of potentially James and Sarah or Janelle, to where, again, for her, she looks at this as a lose-lose. Again, I do think, for me personally, this is still the incorrect decision. I think at this point, it still is worth going back against this deal and keeping James and Sarah as a game, especially because, again, James is such a big threat. There's no way they're going to just allow James to make it to the end of the game, to where, again, I do think it is a spot here where I think keeping James and Sarah around for your alliance is better than the entire opposing side, who are just going to target you no matter what in a few rounds anyway. To where, again, I do think this is still the incorrect call, but at this point, we do see Rachel putting in legwork and talking to their friendship, trying to make deals for herself now. They don't even stick to that, to where, again, ultimately, I just think this is the wrong direction for Rachel to be taking in this spot. But again, we get to nominations where Howie does end up blindsiding James and Sarah, with Howie even saying that maybe in 20 years, I'll be looking back at this and thinking it's a bad move, which you will. With James just being stunned, says Howie, Janelle, and Rachel can't be that stupid, which, I mean, at least Howie is. But we also get a lot of aftermath to this nomination ceremony, with James wanting to confront Howie and Rachel, while Sarah doesn't, saying she's done, but ends up confronting Howie anyway. Only for Howie to end this conversation admitting that he might have made the wrong call and destroyed the alliance, only to later also say that he made the mistake of trusting James, which, again, just led to this being very confusing of what Howie actually thought. Where, again, all this just felt very inconsistently shown on the show. But to be fair, I mean, James just continued to lie in this conversation for, like, no reason, still saying that, you think I would swear on the Bible, only for us to obviously flash back to him swearing on the Bible. But through that, obviously, James now knows that Yvette ratted him out, which you would think would lead to something, but it doesn't, because he has no other options anyway. He has to work with Yvette at this point. But anyway, we do get to the players just kind of randomly being given a Mexican party where they all get piñatas, and James and Sarah are the first to notice this and partying on their own, only for the others to later figure it out. But again, they all get a piñata to decorate, with Sarah putting tears on hers while James has him flipping the bird, because that's James for you. But also, I did find it very strange, this moment of, like, them using Pinata Howie, the DR, but finally giving him the Chiron dummy, which clearly showed you production's outlook on all this. But, and we eventually get more fighting here, Sarah confronting April now, but also revealing them that Kaser turned against him before he left, with Sarah just being clearly, like, emotionally distraught throughout all this, having to be pulled away from James from this confrontation. Though we do see Janelle talking to them, with Sarah saying that they're doing the same thing with them that they did with Michael. In a spot where Janelle is still pretty apprehensive of the friendship here, in a spot where she did actually try to convince Howie to go back on his word and target Maggie, but that was obviously to no avail, especially how deep in they were at this point. Either way, we do get to the veto pick, where Howie ends up picking Rachel, while Sarah picks Jennifer, not wanting someone strong and wanting to play against somebody that she didn't want to punch in the face, which was funny. But James picks Yvette. She was the only one he wanted to give the opportunity to not use the veto on him, I guess. Either way, each player ends up being sequestered, and they go out one-on-one, with the reveal that this is essentially a redo of the Piggy Bank Challenge from BB5, but with piñatas and candy this time, where they end up putting candies into each piñata, where each player gets 10 to distribute, where the closest to 20, but not over, ends up winning, which I've always liked this challenge. It's the last time we ever see it, but to be fair, it is one that is very easy to pregame, though obviously they didn't here. But here we see Sarah putting almost all of hers into Howie's, which could have backfired on her, while Yvette puts all of hers into James's. All of James splits between Howie and Rachel. All Howie, Jen, and Rachel all split amongst James and Sarah, which really ends up leading to this being kind of a mess for the majority, where they end up getting 16 into Howie's, but James ends up winning with 18. Where again, the fact that more people didn't just go all in on putting theirs in James is kind of surprising, but this leads to James proceeding to call them R words, because that's what James does. But again, this ends up being the third formal veto win for James, already breaking the record at this current point for veto wins, even though again, he has more to go. But with this, it becomes extremely obvious that Sarah's going home, as even with her friendship replacement nominee at this point, they simply don't have the votes to save Sarah without the help of the friendship themselves, which was also a reason why putting up James and Sarah was such a dumb move to begin with. But it's here where we see Howie leading a house meeting on what to do, with the entire house still being on board to target James following this. Here we do see April initially being willing to go up, though ends up being worried that James could be rallying to take her out, and decides that Yvette is actually the better choice, as James and Yvette are close, even though, again, at the end of the day, it's not like he's going to be campaigning against Sarah at any point. Sure, all this, again, just felt like more of an excuse, and again, we do see Yvette being annoyed at this, not at the fact that she's going up, as she actually volunteered to go up, which again, questionable, but more so in the way that April's handling over this, leading to them bickering, which is obviously terrible gameplay for Yvette in the spot where she knows she's going on a block. Why are you pissing off one of the swing votes? But this does show a fracture here within the friendship alliance, where really a lot of the suspense in the back portion of this week really comes from the fact that April and Jen did seem to genuinely consider taking out Yvette in this spot, which also would have been an astronomically dumb move, as it would be them weakening their side for like no reason. But here we do get some focus around the three potential returning players, getting to see their pleas to come back to the house. All of the players inside the house get to campaign for who they want back, with Janelle kind of campaigning for Michael, even though again she seemed to be perfectly fine with Kaser coming back, obviously, alongside Sarah, which was very random, but obviously that seemed to be more so just an anti-Eric and an anti-Kaser take there. Maggie ends up campaigning for Eric, saying that he equals duty, honor, integrity, trust, I guess. All of that says that she wants the gay community to vote for Eric, because that's something they would do, I guess. Oh, Bo is just silent with his Eric shirt, which I did find funny. Oh, we see Howie and Rachel obviously campaigning for Kaser. Oh, well, James says keep all of them, and that he just wants Sarah, which I will say, again, Sarah does get largely screwed over in this spot, again, being the only pre-juror with no chance to come back in this spot. But following that, we do actually get a pretty funny April Yvette fight, but we do finally get some drama during this segment, as April and Yvette literally get into a fight as they're making their shirts. Though across this week, we do end up seeing Maggie actually getting annoyed at Yvette as well, particularly how close she's getting to James, where we do see April do some campaigning here against Yvette to Howie and Janelle, and seemingly genuinely considering taking her out, but at least does convince Howie to put up Yvette, saying that Yvette's dangerous and would be willing to save James, which again is a very weird argument to make when again, Yvette would be literally next to his girlfriend Sarah. It's like, they think Yvette is going to be more loyal to James than Sarah, but either way, we get to the veto ceremony. James uses the veto in a spot where he does say that he didn't know who he's going to be using the veto on, which is like, I mean, come on, you knew. But either way, Yvette is the renom as expected. So we do start the eviction episode with Yvette being very unsure on April and Jen, with Jen even telling Maggie directly that she wants to target Yvette, with Maggie saying that Howie and Rachel are trying to convince Jen and April to turn, when it's like actually kind of the opposite. It was actually April and Jen that convinced Howie and Rachel to want Yvette out, but it does lead to Maggie being annoyed at April and Jen across this week as well, particularly in how much they were talking to the likes of Howie and Janelle. I mean, you get this like very awkward moment where Maggie just confronts them, asking them where they're voting, only for them to just be silent. But again, they end up getting on the right page, because it would be really dumb to not be on the right page. But again, April and Jen do a lot to really just try to play both sides during this week in a way that Maggie just simply was not able to do. And I think that for me is one of the biggest criticisms of Maggie's game, the fact that she just had no connective tissue to the other side. Again, you had Yvette who had connections to James, you had April and Jen who had connections to Howie and Janelle. Maggie was never really able to do that, and obviously that leads to the strong suits of Maggie's game, the fact that she was able to keep this friendship together enough to largely benefit her game. But I do think her inability to really create connections outside of her group is definitely one of the bigger failings of her as a player. But either way, we do get to the eviction, where it's a pretty typical 6-1 vote for Sarah, where obviously James is the only one to vote to keep her. Again, who cares about that? Because we obviously need to focus on who's coming back. Where it is actually kind of funny that at this point, it did seem like April was actually rooting for Kaser to come back, being more worried about Eric regrouping with Yvette, Maggie, and Bo. What would happen with Kaser back in the fold? Oh, well, Maggie is worried if Kaser comes back, is that would have a huge impact, I guess. Anyway, the evicted players come out one by one, and I did like seeing their reactions to seeing who the following boots were. I did find some humor from Michael seeing that Eric was the next out, only for both to see Kaser out after that, considering their connective tissue. But we do quickly narrow it down to just two, with Eric and Kaser being the top two. Then we get the reveal that with 5 million votes cast, Kaser gets voted back into the game with, again, 82% of the vote, which is insane. And again, this is a spot that I remember being very justified as a kid. Again, I loved Kaser. However, again, I did not know if everyone else loved Kaser. To see 82% of America and vote Kaser back in was very gratifying. And I think also very culturally significant, where, again, coming into the season, again, there obviously would have been a lot of biases against Kaser being the first Muslim player, being Iraqi, and again, to see 82% of the audience back him in this spot, again, I think is something that really just shows the impact that Kaser is able to have on this season. And we do get like a really big reaction to Kaser's return, with Howie and Janelle essentially tackle him to the ground and them chanting, "What up, Kaser?" But again, if only it lasted. But wait, before we move on, let's talk about the boot from this week, talking about Sarah. And Sarah's someone that, as I mentioned before, I think is just too kind-hearted for the game. I don't think she really brings much to the game of Big Brother. She was obviously an alternate. She was only on because James' partner ended up dropping out, and I think you can clearly tell why. I just feel like Sarah is someone that, again, doesn't really bring too much to the show or the game, to where, while, again, she's a very likable presence and one that, and very much felt a bit insecure around her relationship with James, and someone that, again, just came off very young. I do feel like she's someone that I don't really have necessarily a bad word about her as a person, just more so the fact that I don't think she's really built for the game of Big Brother here. But now for week 6. One of the most iconic weeks in Big Brother history, but also one of the most devastating as a kid, where I just remember this being so brutal to watch in real time. But it all starts off with probably the most iconic HOH competition of all time, that being the pressure cooker, an endurance challenge of just standing in a cage, holding onto a button for as long as possible, which is a challenge that we did actually see in BB5, which was a record-breaking endurance challenge at the time, though this time they take it to an even further extreme, where in this challenge, once you leave, you can open a box which either contains a prize or a punishment, but also you can only leave in groups of 3, which I would say is kind of a weird aspect of all this, the fact that you're really just locked into this cage until 3 people drop out. It does lead to some humorous moments from it, but obviously there were just so many stakes for this challenge. I mean, this being a spot where Kaser just came back into the game, and again, there still being these 2 warring sides, along with also now this wild card in James. But again, it really just felt like a challenge that had so many stakes to it. Though it is funny that it all starts with the players just being confused by the rules, which was a funny aspect of the live show. But the following episode, the one that actually shows the results of the challenge, ends up being a very unique one where the actual competition takes up a bulk of the episode, where the episode ends up utilizing flashbacks as a way to diversify content beyond that, but which does allow for us to see more character moments, where again, here we obviously get the typical like reaction to the previous eviction and the Kaser coming back in. And right away, we do see the first box opening, with that being a box filled with flies that get released. That, I guess, kind of lame, but anyway, we then instantly cut to 1 hour and 45 minutes, where we finally get the Sarah eviction recap, where it did really feel like James was kind of deflated at this point, as again, clearly everyone else was still targeting him, and it's a major reason why so many stay in the challenge for as long as they do, is again just to beat James. But we then cut to the 2-hour mark, where we get a recap of Kaser coming back, but James just finally not caring at this point, and Yvette telling Eric at the door, with Maggie saying she thought it was a given that America would love Cappy. Boy, were they wrong. But we then get to the 2-hour 30-minute mark, where we get our first proper flashback, being a scene of everybody looking at Bo's wiener, with us getting like a montage of everyone looking over the shower and talking about his size and all. This was so weird. Like, this is also very problematic as well, where we just see them like singing Chocolate Pee Pee, and like April goes in for a second look, and all this gets played up as like really funny, but it's actually just, again, something that would not be allowed in the modern day. With that, we then cut to 5 hours in, where we do get a rule change here, not being allowed to sit or kneel, with a new box being opened up, that being dead fish, so that it would smell, which again, also kind of lame. But also here we get the reveal that the storage room is now full to tempt people to get food, but no one does. But anyway, we do see Bo and Jen start dancing, leading to another flashback here, a segment about how Jen is a professional dancer and tries to teach Rachel how to dance, but she's not that good, and this is all boring. But anyway, we then get to 7 hours in, where finally we get our first elimination here, which that kind of insane it happens 7 hours into it. But again, Bo is eliminated here for touching the ground, and ends up opening a box, revealing a cocktail bar, which is really humorous. Again, he's stuck in this cage until 3 people go out, and he just gets ridiculously drunk while in there, leading to people being annoyed at him, which is humorous. But eventually Janelle drops out as well, opening a box, revealing she gets a Netflix subscription, which is funny that this is, again, before Netflix was actually good, along with a TV and DVD player, with obviously the friendship being upset and clearly jealous here, where we cut to 8 hours in, where April says she's willing to drop out if Janelle gives her prize, with Janelle saying, like, why would she do that? Because, again, like, why would she do that? And again, April just clearly wanted out already, with Maggie being upset at her for wanting to make deals. But again, April drops out, pretends like she didn't do it on purpose when everyone knows that she did it on purpose, but ultimately gets $3,000 out of her box, so good for her. We then get 9 hours in, where we get another rule change. Now you only being allowed to use one hand, where at this point we're already nearing the record that was set by BB5, which ultimately this breaks by quite a bit. But Yvette ends up being eliminated here after she accidentally touches with her other hand, being really emotional and opening a box just for it to be an air horn that plays now. But it does lead to some focus around James, who ends up asking Rachel if he's safe, only for her to look away, and lead to this very ridiculous content from James, him saying that she had the face of a demon that was consumed by greed and fear, leading to him proceeding to drop out as he realized through Yvette dropping out that he was playing selfishly, which is like, yeah, that's kind of what you do in Big Brother. With James saying it's not about the game and that he wanted HOH for the wrong reasons, for revenge, and is better than that, which is like, what the fuck does that mean? Or again, I really just felt like James was kind of over it at this point. And I do wonder if there was a part of James that wanted to go out during this round. That way, again, he didn't have to be in the jury. But anyway, Maggie ends up dropping out right afterwards to get a prize, which again is also her again, where she ends up getting rotten eggs. Oh, James gets pizza. Again, what great prizes there. But then we cut to the 11-hour mark where we're left with only 3. We got Jennifer versus Kaser and Rachel, with Jen crying, saying she's struggling to hold on, where obviously this turns out to be fake crying with her winking to the camera, which obviously ends up being the shot utilized over and over again. But we do see Jen starting to make some deals, saying that they're both safe and that she'll nominate James for them, which at this point Rachel ends up slipping off. But Jen really ends up playing up just how much she wants to win HOH and that she's okay if she's out next week as long as she gets it. Where we do get Kaser now fully buying into this, making a deal, saying that he'll throw it to her if she noms people from her own side to backdoor James, wanting Maggie and someone else, which he seems to somehow believe at this point, which is kind of insane. But Jen ends up saying that she swears on her life, only for Kaser to finally drop out at 13 hours 53 minutes, which is insane. Obviously the record for longest endurance comp on Big Brother US, nearly beaten by the BB25 one, but ultimately not. But again, Jen winning HOH here really ends up being the start of this tragic downfall for Kaser. This is obviously being an astronomically dumb move here. Again, where right after you came back into the game, a spot where this one side was so gung-ho about wanting you out just a couple weeks ago, for you to throw HOH in this spot is just, again, ridiculous. Now, again, I get that he thought that James was a target ahead of him, but and again, this is a world where you can potentially backdoor him properly by not giving him the chance to play in the veto. It's still a spot where, again, it's not that hard for them to just turn on you instead. They already voted you out before, to where it's just such a bonehead decision here from Kaser. And to be fair, I do think him going out in this way, while very tragic, I think at least like softens the blow a bit, because I did think the first time around it did feel like Kaser just got a bit unlucky with how things played out. But this time it's fully his fault. I think this is a spot where, again, it's undeniable that he just played this round so terribly to be voted out again. But anyway, we do get to Jen's HOH room with, again, her crying over seeing her boyfriend, finding out that he wrote messages to her on the back of photos, which 100% should not be allowed. I'm assuming this slipped by production, though this will not be the last time that messages get slipped past production, though to be fair, this one doesn't really amount to anything. But again, Jen ends up saying initially here that she might have to nominate 2 people from her side, only for April to instantly shut that down, which again, I don't think Jen was actually going to end up going through with that, as again, it would have been really dumb for her to do so. But it does seem like the genuine intentions at this point, though, were to target James and to stay true to not putting up Kaser. But obviously her alliance ends up having different plans by the end of the week. But again, Kaser ends up saying this works out better for them, as he now has a full team playing for the HOH the next week, which again is also a major reason why they shouldn't be going through this James deal. But it still leaves Kaser, again, at least having doubts that the nominations will go his way, as again, like they shouldn't. But Kaser ends up thinking here that she would at least do 1-on-1. And if Jen goes against their deal, there'll be consequences, which, to be fair, I guess there technically are, but not from you. But anyway, we get to the nomination ceremony, where all the friendship ended up being saved first, with Kaser being instantly annoyed here, as obviously she went back on that part of the deal. But that's followed by James's name getting pulled, where and clearly knows it's meant to be a backdoor at this point. We end up with Janelle and Rachel being nominated. Now, the friendship did actually want Rachel and Howie nominated here, as the last remaining duo on that side, though due to Jen obviously having a deal with Howie from the previous week, and also just Jen being close to Howie, she ended up leaving off the block here. But either way, we end up seeing the aftermath of his nomination ceremony with Kaser being upset at Jen, upset that she lied to his face and went back on a promise she made just a few hours ago, with him airing his frustrations out on her, which, again, why are you doing that? That's a really dumb move. As this is just showing Jen now that you doubt her and you might hold resentment against this, which is like, yeah, at that point, why not just take Kaser out? So that won't matter. But we do see Jen's rebuttal to this, which is a bit strange in the fact that she talks about how she has to do this because last week they made a deal to get rid of James, or Sarah. But then when Yvette went on the block, Rachel and Howie tried to flip the vote, which is like, that's not what happened. You tried to flip the vote. It was you and April that tried to flip the vote first. But either way, April and Jen ended up really utilizing this as a way to justify the move that they make here, with, again, also being used to justify not targeting James by the end. The fact that, again, the other side has shown that they're willing to go back on their word, when it's like, again, not really in this case. But again, we see Kaser being really pissed off and throwing his hat, refusing to believe that his alliance will be dismantled in front of his eyes. Which, I mean, they won't. But it is funny that of all people here, it's actually Howie that is the one that's calming Kaser down, saying that don't give them a reason to change their minds. Which, again, to be fair, they were going to change their minds anyway. But again, Howie is wrong at the end of the day. Talk about it as if it's a given that they would backdoor James. But still, it is funny that Howie is the one that's the most calm-headed in this spot. But you do have James talking about how he knows he's getting backdoor and that they're going to load the veto comp so he can't defend himself. This is where we see Yvette coming into the picture, telling James to relax. With her, again, putting in a lot of work here into saving James, which, again, I think is probably the best moment of her game here. She ends up telling him to apologize and look like a good person. With James, again, continuing to play both sides during this week. But again, we do see Yvette telling the friendship that James wants to play differently now, and that the other side took the opportunity to side with James in seconds and were willing to break their word, where, again, they end up having to read that Howie should have had the previous week and recognize the fact that, again, James is at least in the middle. He's at least willing to work with them in certain situations where the others are simply just not. So through that, again, you might as well be targeting those outside of James, which, again, I do think is the correct call 100% for Yvette here. Yvette is someone that, again, has James in her pocket, to where it does make a lot of sense for her to go out and save James. And again, it is also probably the correct call for someone like Maggie, despite the fact that James is targeting Maggie. However, I do think it is a move that I do question for April, and I think it's obviously just outright bad for Jen when you made all these deals, and that just going back against these deals really expedites the target on her back, makes it so everyone just wants revenge on her in particular. Where, again, coming into this week, she was one of the better positioned players in the house. I mean, we're really Bo, April, and Jen were in a pretty solid spot where just no one was actually willing to take a shot at any of them, just because they were kind of lesser threats on the friendship side. But her proceeding to take out Kaser obviously just ends up really blowing up Jen's game here. But anyway, we do get some weird segments leading into the veto pick. One about Howie wearing a Speedo, and another one going around Kaser and Maggie's birthdays. Another party sponsored by Kmart where Maggie gets a PSP and doesn't know what it is. Well, Kaser gets an MP3 player, which cool. But anyway, we then get to the veto pick where Jen ends up picking April, Rachel ends up picking Howie, Janelle picks Kaser, all expected. With, again, this James backdoor seeming to go through. But the competition itself ends up being a giant version of coaster toss, them just, again, tossing discs. Though this one being a bit convoluted in the fact that each disc has evicted player's face on it, and you have to land that specific disc on the number representing the week of their boot, to which to get the points equivalent of the week of their boot, which, again, all this is just very strange. Why they do this? Like, why not just make it a basic carnival game? Everyone really does terribly here, and Rachel ends up pulling out the win, not even scoring that many points. But it's at this point where we do see a lot more work being put in to take out Kaser, with Yvette in particular, again, doing a lot of that legwork. And along with that comes more Islamophobic comments from her, so that's something. But here we also get content from Maggie being upset at having to go against her word, but he wants to take out Kaser as a fuck you to America for not voting Cappy back in, which, I'll be honest, is actually kind of funny. But she ends up campaigning against Kaser here to Jen, saying that, again, at least there's a chance that James won't put them up. Well, they obviously know that Kaser will, which, again, Kaser will put up Maggie, not necessarily Jen at this point. But again, both Yvette And April ended up agreeing to this as well. In a spot where it is actually kind of funny that Bo is the friendship member that doesn't agree with this plan, that he actually does want James out instead. Obviously, again, he has a relationship to Kaser. And I think also probably wanted to split up Yvette and James, but again, they don't listen to him. But again, it's a spot where the friendship doesn't really force Jen to do this. They do, again, allow her to make a decision on her own, but obviously, again, do give their sense on what they want her to do. Where she ultimately does end up making this move to benefit the friendship, which obviously is, again, just a terrible decision for her own game. And we do see Kaser confronting her, asking her what she's doing, with Kaser saying that he doesn't think she has the courage to not put James up, with Jen saying that if Kaser wanted his plan to go through, he should have held his finger on the button, which, again, fair. But by the time of the veto ceremony, it did seem like the Sovereigns kind of picked up on the fact that things might not be going their way and they might end up being betrayed, though it didn't seem like they were in on the fact that they would actually betray Kaser in particular. It felt like they were actually more so looking at Howie as the Renom, because they thought that Jen would at least stick to her deal, which she doesn't, as we get to the veto ceremony, where Rachel used the veto on herself. And we do get Jen really playing this up for the show, saying that people don't trust James, but Kaser admitted himself that his group fell apart without him, so she nominates Kaser, with James acting shocked at this point, in a spot where James did know what was going on here. So again, it's funny how he was just like playing this up, I guess, for the show, but also to pretend to the Sovereigns that he was not in on this plan, as again, he just continuously tries to play both sides. But obviously at this point, again, this adds further vitriol for Jen, where the Sovereigns are just all in on wanting to target Jen for personal reasons, with Kaser being upset how they forgot about honor and are cowards, which again does feel like Kaser being on a bit of a high horse. And we do obviously get the eviction episode with a lot of focus on the aftermath, with again just so much fighting, really being an iconic day at Feeds at the time, with it just being non-stop fights in reaction to the Kaser Renom, where obviously first Kaser confronts Jen, where she admits to breaking their deal, only for Kaser to say that you broke every condition of the deal, saying I handed the HOH over to you and this is what you do, only for Jen to just kind of end the conversation there, saying you're not going to believe me anyway, in a spot where Jen does constantly reiterate beyond this that I did not lie, I broke my word, which again, by technicality, that is true, but again, not a great look here, just not openly say that you lied. This then further extends the Kaser getting into a fight with April over how Jen is now sending him home, with Howie and Janelle really taking over from this point on, leading all these arguments, with Howie saying he's a strategical player, but someone hasn't been winning events, and really just goes in on April here, saying he wants to rip the friendship apart, and that April's emotional and a dumb player, really going on to make personal attacks against her, saying that he's going to attack her personally to break her, which really is just him cursing at her, and that he was nice Howie, but nice Howie's done, and you're stuck with me in sequester, saying he's going to play as dirty as it fucking gets, with a funny cut to Maggie just being confused, where again, all this is just him being very obnoxious and really just comes off as a massive dick here, though really at the time, again, we really just ate this up. Again, the audience just loved the Sovereign Alliance, and despite, again, the things that Howie does here being a bit problematic as time goes on, it's still a spot where I feel like a lot of the audience is willing to overlook that just because of how much we hated the friendship. Again, it leads the Howie gang very personal here, which, to be fair, it was April that first brought up the fact that she has a better life outside the house than he does, only for Howie to say that with your fat hubby and your ugly dog, I'm so jealous, honey. April gang very upset at the fact that he's now attacking her family, crying to DR in the bathroom alone, but it doesn't end there. But we do get a deviation here to probably the most iconic aspect of this episode, with Janelle being extremely drunk as she's walking through the house, saying to Rachel, you're so beautiful, and then saying to Maggie, you're such a bitch, and then proceeding to call April, proceeds to yell at April, saying she's a gold-digging bitch, only for Howie to now say it's the buxom blonde versus the busted blonde, which he'll give a nickname to eventually. But to be fair, April does also call Janelle a slut in this spot, but it does lead to Janelle calling Bo a gold-digging whore, and you would date older men, which again, there are rumors about why she says this, but again, both here are just literally drunk and just yelling at each other in such an over-the-top way. And again, really funny that even Yvette here admits that they're telling the truth about each other. She doesn't really feel like her like fully backing Bo in this spot, but and it seems like a very playful fight with them just like kind of lightly pushing each other until it gets like very serious and they just like start screaming each other's faces, again, clearly just because they're so drunk, with Bo just yelling, I hate you, and again, a very iconic fight there. But it does lead to April talking about how she now wants Janelle out of the game and that she doesn't deserve to be here, with Yvette being annoyed at how the friendship are now falling apart. But it actually does lead to an aspect this week that I didn't know about until I looked back into the live feeds, but it did seem like Janelle was pretty willing to go home in this spot, that she, again, did not want to be in sequester, and again, was kind of okay if this ended up falling back on her, which again, I think definitely plays a factor in why she's doing this. Again, otherwise, this is obviously terrible gameplay. But is obviously also what makes her such iconic TV. But again, the fighting doesn't end there, as Howie and Janelle go directly for April, with Howie now dubbing her Busto, short for Busted Blonde, which will proceed to be his nickname for every single time they get into argument from this point forward. But which obviously in general, the usage of this term Busto is, again, very problematic from a modern point of view. Again, very much reducing her to his claims of her botched plastic surgery, which again would not be received well nowadays. But something I do find funny about all this is the fact that like Howie calls out that you can't compete without your smokes, only for April to say you can't compete without your finger, with the reveal now that Howie had lost a finger. But again, Janelle saying that's a low blow, which is again surely nothing else you've said throughout all this has been a low blow. And again, I find it funny that again, like the edit portrays this as we're supposed to be sympathetic towards Howie and Janelle, and again, they're obviously also saying very terrible things here. But we then cut to the next morning where the fight continues with Howie again just continuing to bully April, like asking her how it feels that America hates you and still calls her Busto for short. Says America's cheering against her, I'm rooting against her, that she only has pepperoni barking for her, to which we then cut 2 hours later with him still yelling Busto and mocking her, swearing on pepperonis. And it goes on probably the most over-the-top aspect of all this, the fact that he then proceeds to talk about wanting to make pizza and that we're out of pepperoni and where do we get pepperoni from, which then cuts to April sobbing in confessional about how he wants to eat her dog, which is so over the top. And I do love April proceeding to say that don't talk about my dog and husband because they're not here to defend themselves, because surely pepperoni would defend himself in this spot. But really just obviously it's such an iconic episode here. Again, this series of fights really will live on in Big Brother history, even though obviously a lot of it does come off very problematic nowadays. But either way, we do get to the eviction, where during the eviction speeches, we have Kaser thanking America, but apologizing for what happened this week, which obviously just feels like a very sorrow farewell to him. Always see Janelle saying that she hasn't lied or deceived, with Jen just laughing on the sidelines, but ultimately obviously leads to Kaser getting voted out unanimously, actually being the end of Kaser's story on BB6, which obviously, again, was an incredible run here. Obviously, he comes out of this being one of the most popular players of all time, I think alongside Janelle. Obviously gets brought back the following season with overwhelming support. Kaser, again, was just such a big name at the time, such a fan favorite, my personal favorite as a kid, though obviously very questionable player. And I will say again, if he actually get booted in week 4, I would probably have a higher opinion on him as a player, as I do think he actually plays particularly well in like week 3 in particular, and how everything comes together. And while obviously again it was in a spot where he didn't really create a solid enough backup with the opposition, it was still a spot where he just gets very unlucky in the fact that Maggie in particular wins HOH, and then that James and Sarah both win the veto, to where I think otherwise there at least would have been outs there for Kaser. Though obviously again, like his return here is just inexcusable. This is just like astronomically bad gameplay from the throw the HOH to the opposition, expect them to dominate 2 of her own allies, and then proceed to just be completely aloof as he ends up being blindsided himself, to where, and I think he plays terribly on the return here. But again, I do think he actually like does some pretty good work earlier on this season, and obviously again, he's just such an iconic presence for the show, one that is very culturally significant. The fact that, again, I think he was like really the first Muslim player people saw on TV and actually grew to like, where again, even with Survivor at this point, it was really just Ibrahim. I don't know if people were loving Ibrahim on Survivor Palau, where Kaser obviously just really makes a big splash on this season, becoming one of the most likable players of all time, though one that ends up having obviously just a very tragic downfall by the end here. And now for week 7, which really ends up starting a pretty speedy end game to this season, where we do have less than a month left of the season, and we're just now starting the jury phase, though it's also where the season kind of starts to slow down, with most of the season's most iconic moments past us, especially after this following HOH competition, where it also just translates to stagnant gameplay, where it largely just turns out to just be the two sides going after each other, where really the comp results in determining pretty much everything from this point on. Though something I never really noticed about the end game until making this video is just how abbreviated it ends up being portrayed on the show, to where there actually isn't even a single round of the game from this point forward that is portrayed in a traditional way. Obviously, again, Big Brother is structured with 3 episode weeks. However, from this point forward, there are 2 double eviction weeks. There is a week that just so happens to only have 2 episodes during that week. And after all that, we're in the end game, to where, again, I think BB6 is a season that largely escapes this notion of being looked at as having a rather lackluster end game. One, One, I mean, see, there's still some power shifts along the way, but also because, again, I do think just how abbreviated this final stretch of the season is allows for these more forgotten weeks of the season to not come off as monotonous as it does on a lot of other seasons. But anyway, we do get to the HOH comp, a Q&A about the evicted players, where it does get to a tiebreaker between Bo, April, and Janelle. The question, how many light bulbs were in the luxury comp, with the Janelle putting 300 initially, only then later changed it to 275, with the answer actually being 286, meaning Janelle narrowly pulls out that win. The first formal comp win for Janelle, obviously a spot where Janelle now is renowned as this all-time great challenge beast. Yeah, I do feel like for BB6 in particular, while she does perform pretty well in certain competitions, I do actually feel like it takes her a while to pick up steam on this season. But this then leads to, again, another one of the more iconic moments of the season, with there being a massive reaction to Janelle's win. Obviously in the aftermath of the Kaiser eviction, with Howie yelling Super Bowl baby once again, and proceeds to pick Janelle up, with Janelle yelling at Jennifer, give me that key, bitch. And for Jennifer to then toss the key to the side, with this obviously being an iconic moment that gets followed up by another iconic moment where we then have Janelle go straight to the DR, with Julie revealing that it's double eviction week. Again, not getting to the formal double evictions just yet in the series, but again, following the structure of BB5 of just having 2 eliminations over the course of a week, is that pretty much taking place over the course of one day, while the other eviction takes place, again, over the course of 6 days. So again, it's not that different from a normal round. Though obviously on the show only takes place over the course of 2 episodes instead of 3. But either way, we do have Julie revealing this to Janelle, during which we have the audio being completely messed up, which is kind of funny. But we end up seeing Janelle being so excited, which I really don't get why, as this obviously just means that you get a shorter HOH. Also means that you're going to be back to being in danger relatively quickly, to where, again, I don't know why she was so excited about this. And we do see how we literally have the exact same reaction, which again just felt very short-sighted. But here we do end up seeing Janelle being forced to make the nominations here during the eviction episode, where we obviously see her nominating Jennifer and then Maggie, with such vitriol here. That leads to, again, the other iconic moment of Howie proceeding to pick up Janelle as they end the episode, with her saying, bye-bye, bitches, as she leaves, which has obviously become such an iconic line in Big Brother history, but ends up being such a notable Janelle moment, really probably being the moment that you think of when you think of Janelle. But beyond that, again, we have the rest of the round playing out in a singular episode, with that episode starting off with, again, more fighting here between Howie and April, with Howie telling the friendship that karma bites you in the ass, which I did find it kind of funny that we literally have Jen smacking her ass after he says that, only for that to be completely overshadowed by the fact that April starts calling him out for being immature, and Howie responds yelling out, he's the star of this show. Don't talk to me like that. And you suck too bad to waste an HOH on. Which again, obviously still terrible gameplay. I mean, which again makes it even worse by the fact that, again, like, next round starts the following day. Why are you just further pissing off April in this spot? She could potentially be HOH in such a short period of time. But here we do also see James trying to calm Howie down as well. Again, him still continuing to try to play both sides. Where we do end up seeing former sovereigns making a deal with James during this week, wanting his help to get rid of Jennifer in exchange for them helping him get rid of Maggie for down the road, who is actually the person that James wants out in the spot, which I will say in general, like, they should all be wanting Maggie out. Maggie really is the glue to the opposite side, and getting her out really disperses the opposition. All while, again, Jennifer is just someone that just feels like an emotional target. It really feels like they're just targeting her just because she's the one that they put all the blame on for getting her to Kaiser, which is also funny considering, again, they're essentially doing what Maggie did in week 4. They constantly complained about that, she's only making these nominations to get revenge for Eric, when it's like, you're literally doing the same thing now to get revenge for Kaiser. But either way, we do get Janelle's HOH room, where the friendship don't even bother going up. It just ends up being Howie, Rachel, and James, with, again, James being able to talk about how he has to be careful playing both sides as everyone thinks he's with them. But again, this ends up being one of the few times I can even remember in Big Brother history that someone doesn't go to someone's HOH room reveal, where I feel like most times you at least see people faking excitement over these situations, where here we just literally see almost no one even go up. But here we see April coming off a plan to use the veto on Jen and have Yvette go up to where they can vote Yvette out, because Yvette's in it for herself, clearly. So while the fact that, like, April continuously pretends that she's close to Yvette, she's attempting to undercut her at most turns. But either way, we do get to the veto pick, where Janelle ends up picking Howie, Jen ends up picking April as expected, while Maggie picks Yvette, with the challenge ending being a hockey challenge, with them having to hit goals with the pictures of players on them, which is like, what's the point of the faces being on them? But either way, similar challenge to the basketball challenge from BB5, with the best time to hit all the goals ends up winning, with Janelle ending up winning this, though Jen did pretty well as well, though just couldn't get that last goal, with April obviously having to make a comment how Janelle only won because she dated some hockey players. But we do see Yvette here, though. But obviously at this point, again, both Janelle now having the veto, they obviously have all the power here to determine the nominations, in a spot where, again, something also very rare and big about the history, we do actually see them change their own initial nominations, but not under the context of a back door, where obviously typically if you see the HOH proceed to use the veto, it's usually an attempt to backdoor somebody where the replacement is the target. That's not the case in this spot, where instead we actually see some focus around Yvette, her saying that she thinks James has her back and has to trust him. Which, I mean, to be fair, James did not want to bet out. But again, this is funnily followed by James proceeding to literally tell the Sovereigns that he thinks Yvette being on the block is actually better than Maggie. Which, again, I do get the rationale here. Because, again, with Maggie on the block, again, James himself is tempted to take out Maggie. But even beyond that, obviously, April's incentivized to keep Jennifer. Again, Beau could potentially switch his vote. Again, I think it is definitely a much more precarious position than if Yvette is on the block. Where in that spot, James is not voting out Yvette. Beau is not voting out Yvette. And, again, it really just puts all the power into the Sovereign's hands. So again, I do get this change in nominations. Yeah, it is something very strange to see my big brother. And to be fair, it was also affected by the fact that obviously like Janelle didn't get any time to think about her initial noms, where I do think had this happened before, that she probably would have just nominated Yvette to begin with. But because obviously she didn't get time to properly think about all the scenarios, she ends up going with Maggie instead there. But ultimately, again, we do get Janelle using the veto on Maggie in a spot where Maggie is pretty surprised here. And there's a funny moment here from Janelle accidentally saying, I choose to evict instead of to nominate Yvette. That leads to Yvette kind of freaking out. But ultimately, again, this result was pretty predictable. Jennifer still eventually gets voted out when we get to the eviction, which ends up being the first time that the friendship actually has to turn against each other. First time they had to vote out one of their own, which, again, looking back at the boot order, it is kind of sad just to see how many people more aligned with the Sovereign side ends up going home early on, but it's largely on them. But anyway, it also ends up being our first live vote, with every vote after this also being a live vote because they need to waste time on the show. Though obviously, again, that's the norm in modern Big Brother. But obviously, April ends up voting for Yvette here, while everyone else votes for Jen, where again, there wasn't really much suspense in this vote, where Yvette wasn't particularly close to going out at any point. And with that, again, we lose Jennifer, who realistically was kind of a non-factor on the season for a good chunk of it. Really, outside of her situation with Michael early on, she really is becoming kind of purple in the show, being largely overshadowed by likes of April, Yvette, and Maggie, to where it really isn't until her HOH that she really pops back on the show, and obviously more for more negative reasons, where obviously Jennifer becomes extremely hated in the outside world because of her being the one to take out Kaser. Where I remember hating Jennifer at the time, though obviously, again, I think a lot of that reaction was very extreme. There's obviously a shame there, and realistically, I don't think Jennifer is really even the worst player in the world. Obviously, she makes a move that, again, completely sinks her game and taking out Kaser, but really before that, I actually feel like Jennifer was actually playing a pretty competent game, where, to be fair, I did think it would have been tougher to go on to win the game, but it was still a spot where she was kind of riding in the middle decently well. No one really having their eyes on targeting her for a good chunk of it. Though ultimately, obviously, it kind of blows that up on her own. But with that, we then move on to second round of this double eviction week with another Q&A HOH comp, this time it being about the house itself, where the most points by the end wins, though if you get a question wrong along the way, you're eliminated. With all this leading to a sudden death match between James and Beau, with Beau pulling out the HOH win because James is pretty incompetent winning an HOH on this season. And again, we do end up starting off with some focus on his HOH room, with Howie being Howie and saying that his sister is a POA, a piece of ass, because again, that's Howie. But also we see the friendship put together a shrine for Eric, which I believe they've had before in previous HOH rooms. Yeah, this is the first time we actually see it on the show, which again is just kind of ridiculous that they do this. But anyway, we see Janelle here thinking that she's going to be the target. She literally told people that he's a raging alcoholic and a prostitute posing as a personal shopper, which I'm surprised that part of it made the edit. But also we see Rachel here saying that she feels vulnerable, that her and Howie are a pair, which ultimately ends up being the way that we see the friendship actually deciding, where we do see right away talk about nominating Rachel and Howie. Split up the final pair on that side. Though, again, interestingly, we actually see Maggie not want to do that in a spot where, again, a lot of people talk about how Maggie was really controlling everything, where here we actually do see her talk a lot about wanting to potentially take out James instead, while Beau seems to be very against that idea. Obviously wanted to go for Rachel during this round, and even after that, target Janelle and Howie before he targets James. With, again, Maggie having the correct read here, again, James probably should go before at least Howie and Janelle, and again, it is going to be a tough task to get rid of him, especially in a post-backdoor world where, again, I do think she's speaking sense. And again, we see April also get on board with that, though she has her own reasons for getting rid of James. But we do get mention here of something that, again, obviously plays a major factor in the end game. The fact that Maggie and April talk about being worried about potentially losing the game at the end against James, though they're not worried about facing off against Howie or Janelle. Where obviously, again, as we get further into the season, that becomes so apparent, the fact that the jury is already kind of stacked against the likes of Howie and Janelle. For as much as, again, we love them as the audience, and they were such massive fan favorites at the time, they really had almost no true win equity on the season, just simply due to the fact that, again, the friendship did have the majority on the jury. And again, Janelle was too disliked and Howie was too disrespected to go on to win the game, to be likely to go on to win the game. But this is also the point in the game, though, where we do see Maggie and April really bond, where obviously in the aftermath of losing Jen, April needs a new partner in the game. And again, she ends up finding that partner in Maggie. If only Maggie was ever actually truly loyal to April in the game. But again, just further adds to Maggie having a complete stranglehold on this group, at least in terms of being a major reason why this group ends up sticking together. That being said, during this week, we do end up seeing Howie and James both put in a decent amount of work into trying to lead this campaign against April, exposing her attempts to play both sides, which does spook Bo initially here, though, to be fair, Maggie's able to talk him down to where he ultimately stays the course, which again is the strong suits of Maggie's game on this season. But anyway, we get to nominations where, again, Janelle is safe and she's shocked by that, saying thanks, I guess, only for Howie and Rachel to be nominated. With Bo proceeding to call out Rachel for being shady and playing both sides during the Cappy days, to which she makes a face to that. With Yvette calling her a sore loser for making faces and calls her a miserable old hag. Again, she's 33 years old and being appalled at her poor sportsmanship, which surely won't play a major factor into the results of the season. By the way, we do get to the veto pick, where we do get a big shocker here in Bo picking James to play, with the friendship now fully using James here as a weapon against the Sovereigns, an attempt to, again, stop Howie or Rachel from winning the veto. Which, I mean, to be fair, James isn't really incentivized to use the veto in this spot, as it really just burns social capital and doesn't really give him that much, especially considering, again, Janelle would just be the replacement. So again, I do think it was a relatively safe call to be doing this. But again, along with that, we do end up seeing Howie pick Janelle and Rachel pick April, as they think they can beat her. And this ends up being a more typical modern Big Brother challenge, aka boring in the fact that it's a timed event of them having to run the pool, grab these tokens or players' faces on them, and pair them up with their partners. Again, a really boring challenge, but it does lead to James getting his 4th veto win, and furthering his record at this point, though Janelle ends up actually only being 4 seconds away. With this reawakening that talks about how good of a competitor Janelle is, though ultimately then that doesn't end up leading to much here, where you get to the veto ceremony where James doesn't use the veto, where at that point Rachel's clearly going home, where Rachel doesn't even really try to stay beyond this, where obviously because of this pair's twist, there were a decent amount of partnerships here that were simply there for like one specific person, and Rachel was one of those. Again, it was Howie that wanted to be on the show. Rachel was his tag along, and through that, we do see Rachel kind of laying down her sword here to allow Howie to move on in the game. So again, we get to the eviction episode where, again, nothing really changes here, though we do get a character moment from Bo getting Howie to streak through the house in exchange for him not voting him out, because we need that, I guess. And beyond that, we also get like a Rachel Howie family segment with Rachel's mom and Howie's sister talking about Howie has respect issues with women, which again, I never would have guessed that. Though we do get some strategy that's important in the future, particularly in, again, Maggie and April still being worried about James, thinking that James would take Janelle to the end as he knows he would beat her. Where during this week, we do end up seeing James start to do a lot of work with Janelle. Again, just openly telling her that he's taking her to the end and hoping that she reciprocates, though ultimately, again, she ends up being pretty unwilling to do so, particularly due to her relationship with Howie. But again, it does show James having this awareness that if he wants to win at the end, he needs to be against a non-friendship member, as again, the friendship have the numbers at the end, and especially in a spot where they don't betray their own, they would just handily win against him every single time. So again, he essentially needs to be at the end against Janelle or Howie, which again, at least he recognized that. The problem is that obviously the other players recognize that as well. But again, we do end up getting a pretty fun segment here from James, again, playing both sides against each other, really fueling the friendship's hatred of Rachel, which again also might finally lead to the outlash that Yvette has on Rachel. But again, we get the live vote again. Really boring here, but it is a unanimous Rachel vote, where we do get probably one of the worst goodbye messages in Big Brother history, if not the worst, from a gameplay perspective from Yvette here. Her saying to Rachel that your behavior was out of control and you left me speechless. And I've never seen such poor sportsmanship. Rachel finally making faces the entire time during this, which again is literally why Yvette was making this comment to begin with. And again, we do see her leaving this just being kind of confused of why Yvette is so angry, where ultimately, again, obviously terrible move from Yvette, really ends up costing her the game, her pissing off Rachel to this degree, to which again, that might have pushed the votes over the edge to make Yvette lose that upcoming jury vote. But with Rachel's eviction here, that also does leave Yvette and Beau as the last pair in the game, which does end up increasing the target on their backs from the non-friendship side of things, which takes Beau, who, again, had been in a pretty safe position the entire game, no one targeting him, and also still pretty well liked amongst the friendship members, and turning him into probably the biggest threat on the board, turning him into the person most likely to go if the opposite side ends up winning power in the upcoming week. And through that makes his targeting of Rachel and Howie questionable to begin with, though at the same time, he probably was actually kind of screwed back when Jennifer went out and she's breaking up the last duo within friendship to where he was probably screwed either way at this point. But still, I do think for him, I think he might have been better off leaving in Howie and Rachel as these kind of shields for him. Though again, that never seemed to come across his mind. Again, with that, we end up losing Rachel here. And Rachel's a player here that I think you hear a lot of talk in the modern day about how underrated of a player Rachel is. And I do get that to a degree. I do think Rachel, again, seemed to have a pretty stable strategic mind, especially for someone that did not know Big Brother coming into it. And was someone that was able to be the most palatable to the opposite side, at least not do anything like actively bad to make the friendship hater, not as much as Janelle and Howie. So that's something to credit her. Also the fact that she did have moments of savviness, and I do think most of the time she had a right strategic read on the game, but ultimately, again, she was looked at as a pretty big threat. Also, again, completely mismanages Howie throughout the game, and I do think ultimately I land on the fact that while I think Rachel, again, has potential as a player, I do think she comes off a tad overrated based on how underrated people seem to think of her, but still a player that, again, definitely had some natural game ability for the game. But then we get to week 8, a rather slow week, mainly because the result of it's pretty obvious from the beginning and there's nothing to stop it. I guess in that sense, you can kind of look at this as a game-changing week, but either way, it starts off in the HOH comp, another Q&A of high or low, with funnily Howie, Yvette, and Maggie all going out in the first question, though those lead to a tiebreaker between April and Yvette, with April winning the HOH, the only time the entire season where there isn't a power shift with the HOH, where again, we've constantly gone back and forth between friendship and sovereign over and over again, but this is the first time that the HOH stays in one side's favor, this time obviously being the friendship, sadly. Though we do right away get talk about how still no one has had more than one HOH yet. Only for Janelle to sing Maggie, because obviously Maggie ran Howie's HOH. Only for Maggie to be confused and doesn't get it. Where, again, this is the thing that I just find kind of humorous, the fact that obviously this is a major thing people give credit to Maggie for, yet from Maggie's perspective, even post-show, she still doesn't like fully own up to the Howie move. But anyway, we get focus around April and Maggie right away going to Janelle and Howie, telling them that they're getting rid of James, with the plan obviously being to backdoor James. Again, it being the final 7, the final round, before you can't backdoor anyone anymore as all 6 people playing a veto. Though again, with this being a season that still has the rules from BB5, it means that now that James has not won HOH, they can just guarantee that he can't play and he's just going out from that point, which again, what a shocker, that happens and nothing changes from that. Which again, to be fair, is the correct play. Really for almost everyone involved, is probably the best move for April and Maggie for sure, but even for Janelle and Howie, where really at this point, I think they can only win against each other, and while again, James will take Janelle to the final 2, which again, ultimately, if her goal is to get second place, that would be the correct call probably to keep around James. Ultimately, again, if she wants to win the game, which to be fair, I don't even know if that's how she was thinking about this, I think her correct move here is to go along with this James plan. Now, I think you would debate it a bit more for Yvette in particular, Yvette who obviously has a very close relationship with James, though even as is, James doesn't even seem to want to take Yvette to the end, or while obviously it's always a good option for her, turning James is again very prone to just winning out at this point. Again, I don't even think it's necessarily a shoe-in that she should be keeping him either, to where ultimately, again, it just makes so much sense for everyone to really get on board with this. But despite that, we do get some campaigning here around some, again, micromanaging of things, particularly Janelle and Howie trying to get Yvette on the block instead of Howie, with them being worried that Yvette would vote them out if they're on the block against James, though ultimately, again, as April says here, doesn't matter. As worse comes to worse at this point, Howie and Maggie's votes, along with April's tiebreaker vote, would be enough to save Janelle here anyway. But again, we do end up seeing Yvette initially want to target Janelle instead, which again, I get it, trying to keep James in the game, though it does end up seeming to strain her relationship with Maggie saying that she doesn't think that she'll choose James over her, but doesn't want to give her the chance, which is obviously a further incentive for why Maggie should be getting rid of James at this point. But pretty quickly, we do see Yvette just kind of acquiescing to the friendship here, saying that she's playing selfishly. She would keep James, but James is targeting Maggie and that she can't keep him around because of that. Because obviously that's the reason to do this, is to save Maggie in the game. But anyway, we get the nominations where, again, it's Janelle and Howie as expected. Though something interesting about this week is the fact that there's no Sunday night episode. So really, this episode ends up being structured very similarly to the double eviction episodes, whereas episode ends up containing the veto comp as well. Which, again, if you're going to do that for any week, this is probably the correct week to do it because there's not much really going on. But right away, we do see April telling James she's picking Maggie, with James being upset. Why aren't you picking me like last week? Where obviously at this point, he knows he's getting backdoored. And to be fair, I think that was a large notion around James for a good chunk of this game. The fact that, again, he's kind of just ripe to go out Final 7 because you kind of had to take him out before. Backdoors aren't possible anymore, to where, again, it's just kind of a broken part of the meta after BB5 of, again, I think a big threat like James is someone that you probably would be willing to keep around until that specific round, the Final 7, where it would be relatively easy to snipe him out of the game. But anyway, we get to the veto pick itself, where April picks Maggie, Janelle picks Yvette, and Howie picks Bo, with James not being picked and fully knows that he's done at this point. And with that, we then cut to the competition, which was just a really boring one where you have to find keys in a mud pit and open locks. Again, just so boring, but April ends up winning here, which again just solidifies this James plan, all while also we get the combo to the second safe being given away here, with Janelle winning it. Again, how fortunate. And inside is a trip to the Bahamas, which is kind of lame. I think I would have assumed that the things inside these safes would have been a lot more integral to the game itself, not just like random rewards divvied out. But either way, we see Yvette here again, still wanting Janelle out because of all the prizes she's winning and how lucky she is, which doesn't get helped by the fact that we proceed to get America's Choice, where someone will get a phone call from home. And he says everyone's rooting for Yvette to get it. And what do you know? Janelle gets it instead, getting a call from Michael, which is so funny. To which we do see the friendship being very bitter over this. Like, they can't believe Janelle picked Michael over her mom, and also just the call itself is just very awkward. Again, Janelle just being very giddy, saying her heart skipped. Once again, it's a guy you met for like a couple weeks. Though we do finally see this conversation devolving into Janelle wanting to know if Britney Spears had her baby yet, which again just further pisses off of that, where we see her going into the HOH room, falling to the ground and sobs, leading to a massive tirade here against Janelle, the first, which certainly won't be the last, but we see April saying that she's hurt to know that America loves Janelle, and she has to question the audience's character, so that everyone that watched this show are pieces of shit, which is so funny. That she actually said this, obviously, again, did not help her with the fan base at all. But ultimately, again, this gets used as like red herring to make it seem like Janelle could actually go home here, which with April saying she doesn't deserve to be here, only for us to get to the veto ceremony where April ends up using the veto on Janelle, which is, again, funny how little that mattered. But again, talks about how people would be tempted to get rid of Janelle if she stayed on the block, where it actually looks like this actually did the opposite effect, where because Yvette was so pissed at Janelle, this actually led to April feeling more solidified in having to save Janelle. But ultimately, again, James is the replacement nom, where again, I think the fact that this happens once again, this backdooring of someone that production clearly liked, does lead to some major changes for down the road. I think this is the main breaking point for why they end up changing the veto pick in BB7 to be random, which obviously is the correct choice to do there, as again, in this format, it's just so broken. And again, I think this is a fact that is kind of forgotten about in the modern day. I feel like a lot of people just remember it as the 5-finger plan, and it was Jace's backdoor, and that's when production realized how broken it was, when aired up, production probably recognized it was broken at that point. But again, they didn't seem to care until it literally happened again the following season here. But again, we get to the eviction episode where there isn't much suspense here. James knows he's screwed, saying that he doesn't have a chance against Howie, and that his only chance is to get Yvette and Bo, and also to flip over Janelle, which was, again, just never happening, though. We did get a funny little moment here of James and Howie just openly campaigning to Maggie in front of each other, with the edit showing this as, like, super serious, when it clearly was, like, kind of a joke, with Maggie just not really caring about either argument, with Maggie really not taking any of this in anyway. But again, we do see James attempting to pull over Janelle, which, again, I can at least see the argument for Janelle making this move. Again, it definitely makes her more likely to go to Final 2, especially with James potentially winning a lot of competitions, and also being a shield in front of her, which again, Howie isn't even really. So again, I would understand the rationale for doing this, but I think at this point, if she wants to win the game, her only true chance is against Howie, and even then, she probably still loses. But it is funny that James proceeds to leave this conversation, only to go to Yvette, and then proceed to lie to Yvette that Janelle is on board in an attempt to get her to promise her and Beau's votes to him, where again, this just would not have lasted, and also again, just was never happening anyway. But beyond that, we do get a family segment for April showing her husband, who talks about how he's big bone, not fat. We get this weird shot of him saying, "You want some of this?" showing off his tummy and all this. It's just so weird. Anyway, we also get a jury house segment here where we do see Jen saying that she doesn't want to be around Rachel. She's boring, and what do you know? Rachel shows up. And again, throughout the jury segments on this season, we do get a lot of clear animosity between the sides, with again Rachel taking shots at April, with Jen just rolling her eyes the entire time. But either way, we did get to the eviction, where I did find Howie's speech here. We kind of find him saying that he's a waste of an eviction, and it's 5 vetoes versus 0 vetoes. All James says, "Thank you for making it easy to win those vetoes." Where again, it felt like James just clearly knew he was going out here, and he ends up being evicted here unanimously in a spot where Yvette did want to give a sympathy vote to him, but ultimately didn't, which to be fair is the right call strategically. Anyway, we lose James, and James is a character here that is really interesting on the show, obviously being someone that is kind of an underdog, but also just kind of a dick at the same time. Again, he's someone that has to win all these competitions to stay in the game, kind of just riding the middle throughout the back portion of his season, simply because he's ostracized by both groups in a split house dynamic. But the also player here that definitely has some skills for the game. Now, again, he is very sloppy, but I do think the fact that he is so unapologetically lying in the game is something that definitely does benefit him at points in the season, though also, again, the leading caught and people being really upset over how he could do those sort of things. But still, I do think he definitely shows some skills for the game. Though obviously this isn't the end of James' story. He ends up coming back obviously for a following season, a spot where I do think he does improve upon his game, not to a radical degree, but again, he's someone that I just think is a really fun villain for the show. And while again, he definitely says some problematic things at points, I do think he ends up being a pretty interesting character, a very unique way of playing the game that kind of made him a shoo-in for him to return the following season. But then move on to week 9, which ends up being another double eviction week, because again, they need to rush the end game of the season. The start of an HOH here is, again, more carnival gamey, or either roll a bowling ball down a track, and the one that scored the most points wins, with Howie ends up pulling out the win here against Beau by 1 point, again, getting back to the power shifts that we would be expecting, and also Howie becoming the first 2-time HOH of the season. Again, if you don't include Maggie earlier. But I do find it funny how it's this time that Howie doesn't end up yelling out Super Bowl, baby, which he did pretty much every other time one of his allies won. But either way, again, it gets revealed to him that it's a double eviction week, with this time Howie being annoyed because he realized how not beneficial it is to him. But either way, he ends up doing the nominations live, them obviously nominating Yvette and Beau, the last remaining pair, which ultimately I do think is probably the right call at this point. While obviously Maggie is a much more dangerous player, I do think at this specific point in the game, having, again, a pair that is so incentivized to go to the final 2 together in Yvette and Beau is pretty dangerous to keep in the game at this point. But it's funny that in the aftermath of this, we do see Yvette being upset that she's the only one to not win a HOH yet. But funnily, not upset at Howie, but instead being upset at Janelle for still being here because she has the worst soul she's ever seen, I guess. But anyway, we get the HOH room where Howie finally gets his lightsabers, where he cares more about his lightsabers than his actual photos from home. And we obviously have him play fighting with Janelle, which he obviously ends up hamming up for the show. This is here where we get introduced on the show to Maggie and April being partners in the game now. In a spot where April seemed to be pretty loyal to Maggie. I do think April would have stuck by Maggie to the end. Oh, Maggie did seem to be a lot more split. And to be honest, probably wouldn't have been split at all had it not been for the fact that Beau was still in the game, where realistically, I do think Maggie always had more of a connection to Yvette. Though at this point was kind of more so riding in the middle. But again, we do see some of the struggles that Maggie has in playing this middle position in the friendship, where we see Yvette and Maggie talking, with Yvette wanting Maggie to play the veto for her. With Yvette even saying in this spot that even if she wins, she would not use the veto, as that would mean that Maggie would go up, which is kind of insane. Especially insane the fact that, again, the other option would be using Beau, someone that you actually know in real life. But again, Yvette does end up wanting Maggie to win the veto here and use it on her to essentially force April out of the game. In a spot where Maggie says that she'll be in a horrible position if she proceeds to win the veto, which, to be fair, is a major aspect of Maggie's game. That is the fact that, again, she ends up obviously throwing a lot of competitions, particularly in spots where she'll have to make a decision between her own fellow friendship members, because, again, she didn't want to be making those calls. So, again, she has this massive perpetuity to attempt to avoid conflict, which, again, I do think is one of the stronger aspects of Maggie's game, the fact that she is very aware of the fact that there are things more important than competition wins in the game. And recognizes the downside of winning competitions at points. Ultimately, I don't know, she won a lot of comps even if she was fully trying in them. I do think the fact that she at least recognizes the fact that winning competitions can put her in spots that can burn the relationship she's cultivated. Though this is a spot here where she talks about wanting to win it though because she's worried about getting backdoored. And again, I wonder what this is leading to. But again, we do get to the veto comp where Holly from BB5 ends up arriving and hosting a competition where it's really funny that's Holly from BB5 being the only BB5 player to actually make a cameo on this season. But obviously we have Howie being excited to see her because it's Howie. But again, she ends up hosting the veto comp, that being BB Casino, a really lame veto competition here. One that I think is a cool concept, but just ends up being kind of broken in the fact that we end up seeing the players being given 5 chips. And essentially the game is a pretty basic Q&A comp, the one where they have the bet chips, though it's not necessarily entirely about getting the questions right, but more so on how many chips you bet on each question. So again, getting a question right doubles the amount of chips that you bet. The problem is that the questions are really fucking easy, leading to literally a 4-way tie initially here between April, Yvette, Janelle, and Maggie, with Bo and Howie being the only ones out here, particularly because they just didn't go all in from the beginning. Focus around how the girls are being the guys. And going to the tiebreaker rounds, we do have Yvette getting a question wrong along the way, but ultimately that round ends up still leading to a 3-way tie, to where we get to another round where Yvette doesn't end up going all in, getting eliminated there, to where we're left with Maggie versus Janelle, where we finally get a normal tiebreaker of answering a question with the closest without going over ends up winning, which again, really funny to end up veto competition this way, but ultimately Maggie ends up winning the veto. Again, never would have guessed that. Only the second formal competition win for Maggie, and the last competition she ends up winning. But following this, we did get a pretty funny moment here of Maggie wanting to talk to Howie, and just Howie, only for Janelle to go with anyway. With Maggie being annoyed, with her saying to Howie, can you handle having a conversation on your own? Only for Janelle to say not really, and Maggie saying never mind, where again, all this is a really funny situation. Obviously Janelle just being so paranoid after what happened during Howie's HOH that she has to babysit him the entire time. Though I will say again, like, what could really happen here? Like, we're in a spot with like so limited options. It's not like Howie's ever going to nominate Janelle, where ultimately, again, I don't know why she had to be so protective here, but ultimately this does end up, again, kind of lessening people's perceptions of Howie, really just looking at him as a massive puppet for Janelle, which obviously, again, they demonize Janelle for, but also it does seem to lead to the women just having no real respect for Howie as a player. But anyway, you see Maggie talking to their friendship about what she should do, where ultimately, again, it should be kind of obvious, as even if she does use the veto on Yvette and Bo, friendship member will still go home, and ultimately, again, it's a pretty good move for her to get rid of Bo. Bo is somebody that she has the least amount of connective tissue to within the friendship. While Bo is, again, one of the more likely people to win a jury vote, while also Bo is locking up Yvette, where without Bo there, Yvette's fully loyal to Maggie, to where ultimately, again, this should be a no-brainer for Maggie, though we end up having some very questionable play here for Maggie, where April ends up saying thank you to Maggie for not using the veto, only for Maggie to tell her that I might actually use it, which is like, one, why are you telling her this? Like, this is just showing April that she's not your top priority. Well, also, again, it's just a bad move to use it anyway. Now, to be fair, in this world where Maggie does use the veto, I think her intention was still to vote out Bo. She's one to, again, show Yvette some loyalty in this spot. But again, it's still a spot where you're really just burning a relationship with April for no real reason here. And just showing that you're willing to put her on the block in a spot where, again, dude, technically never know. You're essentially putting April's game in Janelle's fate, where Janelle was the swing vote and the deciding vote in that spot. To where, again, I do think, again, it is a very precarious position. And again, just terrible gameplay from Maggie to admit that she's considering this. But something interesting, though, is that we do start to get some confessionals from the friendship here, particularly revolving around how they feel pretty confident that they would win if not against a friendship member, where Maggie says that she doesn't think her best case scenario is to go against the friendship at the end, and explaining why she doesn't think that going against April at the end would be the best, while also saying that keeping it around a pair keeps a target in the game, which, again, I think is a fair argument if it was not for the fact that that is someone that's so undyingly loyal to you if Bo was gone, to where, again, I get the notion that the opposition would target Bo and Yvette over you if they stay in the game, but I do think having, again, both Yvette and April actively wanting to take you to Final 2 at this point is probably a bit more important at this specific point in the game. But it is here where we see April getting very emotional at the fact that Maggie's willing to turn against her, with Janelle ending up consoling her in this spot, where I actually do feel like this is pretty good work from Janelle, where throughout these last couple rounds, we do see Janelle actually putting in some pretty decent work to rebuild her relationship with April and really do some decent jury management in a spot where ultimately ultimately, again, I don't know if it would have mattered if it feel like the friendship were just pretty anti-Janelle as a whole anyway. But again, I do think she at least puts her best effort into this, even though it doesn't really lead to much. But ultimately, again, we get to the veto ceremony where Maggie ultimately ends up choosing to not use the veto, as again, ultimately, like, Yvette was fine if she didn't use the veto. So again, I don't know why she was considered doing all this to begin with anyway. And following that, we get straight to the eviction, where we do get Bo getting voted out in a 3-0 vote, with again the vote not properly being explained. Although again, it's another one of these spots where Yvette wanted it more. Also, Bo was again just was looked at as a bigger threat, better competitions. But again, it didn't really make that much sense to keep Bo in the game at this point for most people. To where ultimately again we lose Bo, and Bo's someone that I think could have been a very fun character if he was shown on the show. I think Bo kind of has the similar issue to Jen, the fact that he is largely overshadowed in the edit. Where I do believe he is the most under-edited of the entire season, and it's a shame considering, again, he seems like a really fun character when he is shown. But again, it does feel like, again, the likes of Yvette, the likes of April, the likes of Maggie just took the forefront from him. Oh, well, again, he really doesn't have like a big individual moments. I mean, I guess he has his fight with Janelle, and that's really his landmark moment. But again, unlike Jennifer, who again at least has that betrayal of Kaser and is such a major presence during her HOH week, Bo doesn't really have that. That being said, though, again, Bo is someone that I know is still involved in the Big Brother community and seems to be keeping up with the show to a spot where I do wonder if Bo would have a lot more potential if he were to play a game nowadays. But obviously at the time, BB6 was someone that, again, was a competent enough player, was someone that was kind of in the middle of the house. No one really wanted to target him, but also was in a spot where I don't know how active of a game he was necessarily playing. But with that, again, we continue on with this double eviction week with another HOH comp, another Q&A comp, where they have the answer to questions by answering with magnets that demagnetize if they're wrong. Where a very strange aspect of this challenge is the fact that the questions include players that are in the game, where obviously, again, they will know the answers to their own questions. So we're getting very strange how they include all this, but either way, it ends up culminating in a tiebreaker between Yvette and Maggie, with Maggie answering one, again, in an attempt to throw it, both in the fact that, again, she generally didn't want to be the one making decisions, but again, in a spot where Yvette wanted it more. Again, previously I talked about how she's the only one to not win a competition, and again, she finally wins her first HOH here, starting a pretty decent winning streak at the end of the game here for Yvette. And obviously it leads to a pretty big reaction from her, as you would expect. Again, her running away, yelling, "Oh my God," literally screaming as they do the outro for the eviction episode, which is funny. But ultimately, as expected, we get to see her HOH room, seeing her get pictures from her girlfriend, in a spot where Janelle ends up saying DR that her girlfriend's ugly as well, which I did feel it was a bit mean-spirited, though again, kind of humorous considering what Yvette's girlfriend later says about her. But also we see Howie ending up eating her Reese's Pieces, and Yvette getting pissed off about that. So that's something. Either way, we also get a segment here about Howie and his lightsaber, doing more play fights with Janelle. But again, this ends up being a pretty basic week here, where it gets set up from the very beginning. Janelle is the target, with Howie as the backup, and just open talk about how April goes up if a replacement's needed. But we do see Janelle's plan here being to win the veto, which, what a plan, but then proceed to try to get Yvette to agree to take out April, which, again, is really their only shot here, where you see, again, Yvette now voicing her worries about sitting at the end against Maggie and April. Again, knowing that she would beat Howie and Janelle at the end, where, again, clearly a lot of the friendship just kind of knew this in the end, which does lead to this interesting dilemma in how this end game plays out, and the fact that, again, a lot of the friendship knew that if they sat at the end against a sovereign member, they likely win, though it leads to the fact that the friendship themselves also create a pact. If they were to end up cutting each other over a sovereign member, that they would end up voting for a sovereign member at the end. Obviously just a threat to keep the friendship members loyal, but it obviously leads to this dilemma for Yvette here, and the fact that she seems to recognize what her optimal path is getting to the end against Janelle or Howie, but obviously is very hesitant to actually make the moves to do that. And to be fair, again, a lot of that's just Yvette as a person. I do think she very much cared about wanting to look like a player that played with integrity, but I do think also a major reason for all this is, anyway, we get to the nominations where Janelle and Howie are nominated as expected, with Yvette saying in her speech that Janelle shows how a woman can manipulate a man, with, again, as expected, Janelle being annoyed by this. But either way, we get to the veto comp, it being the return of Morphomatic from the previous season, and the iconic challenge. Again, them mixing up the cast photos, you having the guess whose features are used in the photos. Pretty basic competition here, one that has most people finishing in the 3 to 4 minute mark, except for Howie, who finishes at 9 minutes, which is pretty insane. But Janelle ends up really dominating this challenge, winning by almost a minute over Yvette at 2:30. Obviously, this leads to the friendship being annoyed at Janelle once again, with April saying that she doesn't deserve to win because she wants a sugar daddy, because that matters, I guess. But obviously at this point, Howie's going home, and we do see the friendship feeling bad for him, where, again, despite his outbursts and how little game respect they had for him, people did seemingly genuinely like Howie, with April saying here that Janelle doesn't have a big enough heart to use the veto on Howie, where it's like, I don't really get why they thought that was even a possibility. Or again, it's not like most people would do that, but either way, we get to the veto ceremony where Janelle used the veto on herself, and Yvette obviously replaces her with April. Where on the eviction episode, the main suspense here really comes from, again, will Yvette turn on April or not? And with Howie and Janelle doing a lot of campaigning here, along with the fact that there was just some tension here between Yvette and April, after Yvette ends up talking about needing the money, and April says that they all deserve it, only for Yvette to be annoyed, because April previously talked about not needing the money. Oh, Yvette needs the money for her family, though again, clearly not enough, considering what she later ends up doing on the season. But beyond that, we do get a family segment from Yvette that is really funny, and the fact that Yvette's girlfriend hates Cappy and loves Janelle, which again, also ironic considering the previous DR about her, but anyway, we also get a jury house segment here of James arriving, to which he flicks them off as he comes in, which is funny. Oh, we get continued comments about how April's a coward, with Jen getting upset at that. Oh, Bo obviously ends up coming in afterwards to ease the tensions there. But either way, we do get to the eviction, which ends up being a 1v1 tie, as expected. Again, Maggie voting out Howie, Janelle voting out April, with Yvette being deciding votes, to which she ends up voting out Howie. Which I would say, I do think as a whole, this is a pretty tough decision for Yvette, and I don't disagree with. Again, it is tough as April is a pretty anti-Yvette presence in the house and can potentially beat her in a jury vote, but again, to keep in Janelle and Howie as a duo together is also a very precarious situation where while Yvette, again, feels pretty confident that she can win against them, also, again, doing this would be a blatant turn against the friendship that might lose her jury votes as well, to where ultimately, again, I do think she makes the right call, even though, again, it might not be for the right reasons. But with Howie leaving here, this obviously leaves Janelle as the last remaining sovereign, facing off against 3 of the friendship members. Also in a spot where a final 4 of all women. Again, the first and really only time in Big Brother history up to this point, which, again, obviously there was some help there in the fact that there were more women on the season than men, and it's not like they intentionally did this, intentionally went to the final 4 women, especially because of the fact that obviously again, Janelle was the target in the final 5 round. But again, obviously just refreshing to see 4 women actually get the final 4 together. Something that, again, is extremely unlikely in most given situations. But either way, with that, we lose Howie. And again, I think Howie is someone that is just really tough to gauge in the modern day because, again, so much of what Howie does is very problematic. Again, he would not be able to do this in the modern day. He possibly gets ejected for some of the things he does in the modern day. That being said, Howie is still a really fun character. Mind you, again, he's a massive ham, and that can maybe get annoying. And I know just in general, again, a lot of people do find Howie very annoying as a presence, and again, I'm sure his actions would be really grating to deal with while in the house itself. Though, at the same time, again, I do think the confrontations that he got in, again, for the most part, I still find fun, even though I do see the problematic nature of it in there. And also, again, I think from a gameplay perspective, while bad, I do think he led to probably one of the most iconic moments of the season, him betraying James and Sarah to completely sink his game, to where again, Howie's someone that I obviously adored at the time, but obviously as time goes on, I can definitely see how problematic of a character he is. But again, I do have a lot of nostalgia for Howie that makes me still enjoy him on the rewatch here. But then we get to week 10, the final 4 round, which despite it being, again, pretty shallow gameplay wise, it does have a decent amount of drama within it. Though again, it starts off with an HOH here. Again, another Q&A, it being before or after, with Janelle getting a perfect score here, winning HOH. Again, a spot where she was coming into this round 3v1, yet now is guaranteed a spot in the final 3, and also essentially guarantees that the friendship has a turn against each other here. Though despite that, Maggie obviously was pretty lock safe in this spot, where especially in this world where Janelle cannot vote, April and Yvette were only ever taking out each other, which again leaves Maggie pretty lock safe in this spot. But anyway, we do get Janelle's HOH room, with her even asking them to sleep over, only for them to shut her down. Though again, we do get a pretty funny moment to me of, again, Maggie noticing that Janelle has dogs too, when we get like Janelle and Yvette bonding over wanting kids. But in general, obviously, this is a spot where the friendship just have to talk to Janelle more, where again, Janelle herself has to reach out more to them, and again, not many other people to talk to where that makes them realize that Janelle is actually a real person. I can't believe it. But really, all that only lasts for a second anyway, as it later just turns into more talk about thinking that she's only doing this for the jury votes. And they also just end up still continuing to slut shame her behind her back, which is contrasted pretty funnily by Yvette getting a montage of her just talking about sex all the time. Now she can't wait to get back to her husband, lean to them utilizing that shot from earlier of her husband saying, "You want this," which again is so weird but funny. Ultimately, this all leads up to a 2.5 Men cost promotion, which is so random. Now, again, I get that obviously 2.5 Men was also on CBS, and obviously the set was not too far away to where, again, obviously makes sense on paper why they would do this, but again, kind of just weird conceptually for this to happen. But again, America's Choice ends up getting to pick a player to get a visit to the set of 2.5 Men. But once again, we have the friendship, thinking it's going to be Yvette for some reason, only for it to obviously just be Janelle again. Where we see her obviously being driven to set, shown around the set by Angus T. Jones, the kid from the show, and proceed to meet Charlie Sheen, which all this, again, not particularly impactful segment there, but what was a lot more notable was the reaction to Janelle being picked here, with the others just being pissed while she's gone. And where, again, this felt like the point where the friendship finally fully came to terms with the fact that, like, Janelle is just loved by America and that they're hated. And again, the meltdown here ends up being edited in a really funny way, where we do see April talking about how she feels like such a crappy person, that she doesn't get why she isn't liked, because she's never hated on people, leading to a cut of a montage of her saying how much she hates specific people. Oh, we get them talking about how they don't get how they don't like the country girl, or the spicy Latina, or the nurse that's been dating the same guy for 7 years. Which, again, like, what does that even mean? But also we see them saying that we have real jobs and we make an honest living, while Janelle doesn't have a job to go back to, because also there's a thing that America would care about. And again, it is really funny that April ends up making fun of waitresses when, like, Yvette is right there and Yvette is a waitress. But again, we have Yvette going back to her thing of saying that Janelle didn't have morals or a bit of a soul in this house, and she won't be rewarding her for that. Where they're saying that the people in her real life knows that she has a heart of gold, and if you believe TV, then you're a shit person, which leads to them cutting to her girlfriend talking about liking Janelle. Again, all really funny they did this. But again, after Janelle comes back, we do get a segment about Janelle and April bonding over plastic surgery, and lean to April again coming off pretty unlikable, talking about how she's different than Janelle because she didn't do it because of insecurity. She did it for cosmetic reasons. Which, again, like, isn't that literally the same thing? But yeah, we also have April here saying it'll be interesting to see what Janelle does with the nominations. It's like, again, like, will it? Like, it doesn't really matter. But again, we do see Janelle here telling April that she's putting up Maggie and Yvette, targeting Yvette in particular. With April seeming to believe this, though, for Janelle, the reality seemed to be more so just a plan to create division within the friendship, more so than her having that much of a vested interest in who actually goes. But again, by doing this, she ends up getting Maggie and Yvette to think that April made a deal, which, again, if her goal is to create fracture in the friendship, I think she does a very effective job here. Though I will say, I don't know if this is the best way to be doing it, as, again, in this world, essentially actually further solidifies Maggie and Yvette together. Again, in a spot where one of them wins the veto and April goes, then, again, I think that even further screws Janelle, where obviously, again, it is a difficult task to get all three of them to be hitting each other separately, but I do think having Maggie and Yvette just get even more solidified here is something that doesn't necessarily help Janelle for this round, though obviously, again, I get the notion that if she was able to get rid of one of Maggie or Yvette, this would create this fracture between April and them, which, again, would make it more likely she gets to the final two. But again, we do see this working pretty effectively, where we have April going downstairs, telling Maggie and Yvette that she didn't make a deal, only for them to not believe her, with Maggie saying, making a deal with the enemy will cost you the money. Where I think at this point it is pretty clear that Maggie is just way more loyal to Yvette than April. Which, again, I think was kind of shown by what happened during the final 6 round of her being willing to use the veto on Yvette and put April up. But again, I think this just makes it even more abundantly clear that she was intending to go to the final 2 with Yvette over April in this spot. But anyway, we do get to the nomination ceremony where Maggie and Yvette are nominated. Maggie and Yvette ending up coming off very upset over Janelle's speech, saying it was nothing but a lie. Which, again, is weird considering based on what we saw of it, it was really just her saying that this is a strategic, not personal move. So I found this to be a very strange reaction to what just seemed like a basic speech. Now, I think clearly probably something got cut out of this, where Yvette specifically says in reaction to the speech that Janelle said that she was an outcast when she did that to herself. Despite the fact, again, the show never mentioning that. So again, all this is just edited in a very strange way. But either way, in the lead up to the veto competition, obviously, again, Maggie is right in the middle of the friendship, locked safe, as again, neither the other two are voting her out. Though, to be fair, we do get some talk from April about how she thinks she would auto win the game if she votes out Maggie here, though it doesn't seem like she actually would have done that. But again, I do find it very strange just how openly Maggie ends up talking about how safe she feels in this spot. In a spot where, again, Maggie also just didn't really seem to be wanting to win this veto, as obviously, again, it would make her have to decide between her two closest allies. Not a particularly good spot to be in. But again, the fact that she just openly tells Yvette this, that she isn't going to be fighting for the veto, just feels very misguided. Now, to be fair, this was a concept actually brought up by April, and again, the way Maggie was addressing this was as if it was April's idea, but again, it's 100% a thing that Maggie was actually doing, though, and I do think her telling Yvette this seemed to be pretty misguided here, just again opening up the opportunity to piss Yvette off. But anyway, we get to the final four veto, a typical Days comp of matching players with stats about them, where clearly April is pretty pissed off in the DR during the comp. There again made it pretty apparent that Yvette goes on to win, and what do you know, she wins with a pretty massive reaction here as expected. Keeps on yelling that she's in the final three, with April being upset at how she's celebrating when one of her friends is going home, which that was going to be what was going to happen anyway. But either way, April ends up confronting her and says that she shouldn't have done that and that she didn't win with grace, with Yvette being upset that she's not allowed to jump up for joy, where really this ends up carrying this massive tension between two that has them getting into multiple fights over this over the course of the week, where we see April later confronting Yvette again. And again, there's this weird thing of like blaming Yvette for all of her previous bad behavior, says that it's because of Yvette that she was made to not like Janelle, and says that she's ashamed of things that she wouldn't have done if it was not for Yvette. With Yvette, again, obviously being very upset at this, saying, aren't you 31 years old, and how dare you blame something on me, with Yvette calling her out that the only reason you're doing this is because you're bitter that you're going out, only for April to now talk about how proceed to talk about how she's not even enjoyed being in this group the last several weeks. And you don't make me feel great about myself, which is a very weird conversation at this point, where again, it very much feels like these two people breaking up after a very unhappy relationship. And again, it feels very much brought on by the fact that, again, April now recognizes the fact that the friendship was not particularly popular. I think she definitely worried about her outside perception. And I do think this is her like trying to cover her bases from a public perception point of view. But again, the conversation ends with Yvette storming out saying, if you want the veto, you can shove it up your ass. Which again, really fun argument, though I will say both people here obviously handled this completely wrong. Now, from April's point of view, again, I think this is very petulant, and I think it's just a weird thing to do, to blame Yvette for all your previous actions. But also beyond that, again, it's terrible gameplay, as again, at this point, there's no way that Yvette will ever use the veto on you. And mind you, too fair, she knew that to begin with, but this just further sinks her chances there. Oh, for Yvette, obviously this is terrible gameplay, as again, this is further burning April's jury vote, to where again, it makes April less likely to win a vote for you at the end. Especially as we do see Janelle, again, doing pretty good work with April. Again, clearly doing it for jury management, but still, again, consoling her in this spot. Or again, by the time April ends up leaving, her and Janelle are on pretty good terms. And we see like Janelle like really sucking up to April in her goodbye message, to where again, as much as again it seemed like Janelle just could not win the game, I do think she at least puts in a good effort here to pull over some votes. Though it is through this conversation, we do see Janelle becoming pretty resolute in the fact that she now wants to go to the end against Yvette, thinking that she has the best chance against Yvette, which is again probably fair. With again, if she did get to the end in that position, I do think some people like April and Jennifer would have been pretty rocky votes for Yvette in that world, which again are the votes that she needs to win the game. Now beyond that, we do also get one more interesting bit of strategy here, particularly from Maggie, where Maggie becomes a game changer in Big Brother. The first time I can remember a player actively sending a jury member to the jury with information to relay, shake up their perception from the jury, where obviously we see this become a very effective strategy in future seasons, where again, Nicole Franzel did this very effectively, Paris did this very effectively in BB Can, but Maggie was the first to do it, telling April to relay a message to James. Again, James being a very anti-Maggie presence, though again, one that you think would be willing to vote for a game. You could potentially win him over, again, proceeding to tell April to tell him that he's a really mean person, and all the things that he did to her were fucking rotten, and that he should feel bad about it, which obviously, again, great campaign to get James's vote. Really terrible jury management here for Maggie. And again, I assume April did not go on to relay this message, but really funny that this is like the first point I can remember that a player in the game actively tells a jury member to tell another jury member something, only for it to be something extremely negative here. But beyond that, again, we do get a jury house segment here once again, where again, we still have a divide between the two sides. Though as Howie comes in, we do get a really funny moment to me of James just yelling out dumbass. But also we do see Jen just running into Howie's arms, only for Rachel to say that she hates Jen and she needs to get her skanky hands off him, which again just really shows that divide there. But also shows again that Howie was at least liked by people like Jen, even though, again, not particularly respected. Either way, we do get to the veto ceremony, where Yvette obviously uses the veto on herself. April goes up. Now, question, why are we getting a veto ceremony? Like, we didn't get this in BB5, so I don't get why they did this in BB6. Again, an entirely separate ceremony from the eviction ceremony. Either way, we eventually get to the live show where Yvette does end up voting out April, as expected, with April in her exit interview saying that Yvette took things personally, but she's not going to hold it against her, which I would take it personally too if someone literally told me that everything bad that I've ever done is because of you. But with that, we obviously lose April, and I think April is a really interesting player on this season. I think next to Maggie, probably the most skilled player of this season, someone that was actively playing both sides for a lot of the season, where despite the fact that, again, there was a split house dynamic between the Friendship and the Sovereigns, April was the one that was at least attempting to keep her connections to the other side for longer, and was someone that was, again, actively playing the game, was actively trying to steer people to do things that she wanted to do. Now, again, she didn't necessarily own up to her game, which can be a frustrating aspect of her gameplay style, but I do think she is a player here that, again, definitely had a lot of skills for the game. Had some pretty accurate strategic reads of the game, though I do think her overall feuding with Yvette obviously ends up being pretty bad gameplay-wise from her. But at the same time, though, I do think she is a pretty fun character on the show as well. Now, obviously, again, at the time, very hateable. As time goes on, I can obviously appreciate what she brings to the show, particularly in her feuds with, again, Yvette, with Howie, and how self-righteous she could come off at times. So, again, I think it's being a pretty fun character and a pretty decent player by the end of it. But then we move on to the final 3 round, which starts off with obviously part 1 of the final HOH, it being the typical endurance challenge, with them keeping the motif of you having to hold on to your key, which I do like that aspect of old school Big Brother. They kept that part 1s of HOHs that they eventually got rid of, but it ends up being one of them having to walk around a circular beam, which is supposed to be this lock. A solid endurance challenge here, but one that surprisingly Janelle ends up being the first to drop out here at 3 hours 45 minutes. Oh, afterwards we see Yvette proceeding to try to get Maggie to drop out as well. I think that she's guaranteed final 2 as Janelle's obviously taking her, which again, I don't know about that. But eventually Maggie drops out at 4:20 with Yvette winning part 1. And along with the win, Yvette gets the combo to the final safe of the season. The reveal that inside the final safe is a sign to go to the backyard, where we get the reveal that her prize is 2 Vespas. That's really random, and again, really lame final prize. Anyway, we get to part 2 of the HOH, another day's comp, this one having them answering trivia questions with numbers that enter into a giant lock. Pretty boring, but Janelle ends up winning this one, locking Maggie out of part 3, becoming the first winner to not win parts 1 or 2 of the final HOH, which probably would have been more impressive to me if it were for the fact that both Janelle and Yvette were taking it to the end, though again, that doesn't seem to be the case. Though again, that clearly doesn't end up being the case. But after the competition, they end up walking inside to find $500,000 inside of the dining room table, which is kind of weird they did this. But again, it leads to an iconic moment to me of Janelle just seeing the money and having this high-pitched scream yelling, "It's money!" But ultimately something that doesn't really matter. Not long that we do get a pre-jury checkup in this episode, which was kind of boring. Doesn't really lead to much, just talk about how Kaser's popular. But anyway, the only strategy talk we get here is between Yvette and Janelle, with Janelle pitching to Yvette that Yvette can beat her and that taking Maggie is second place, which again, Janelle isn't wrong. Now, obviously a major issue with this is that Yvette, again, can't be the one to cut Maggie, as that burns her jury votes as well. And to be fair, even in the spot against Maggie, again, it is a close vote and she certainly gets some votes. But again, this ends up being really portrayed as like bonehead decision for Yvette to be taking Maggie to the end instead of Janelle, which again, I don't think is a fair argument, as again, really the move here should 100% be Yvette should be throwing the final HOH. Again, Yvette should not be trying to win this HOH, as again, I think winning this HOH actually loses her the game. What she should be doing is losing this final HOH, allowing Janelle to win, and allow Janelle to vote out Maggie, which would end up leading to Yvette winning. Though, to be fair, even then, it's a little bit of a question mark, considering how April left the game, to where, again, I do think she's inclined to still end up voting for Yvette, but again, it definitely is not as locked in as it should have been. To be fair, again, that is entirely on Yvette for why that is the case, but still, I do think it's a spot here where I think this gets talked about as, again, a really dumb move, one of the dumbest moves, and I do definitely think Yvette makes the suboptimal move by the end, but I do think it's a spot where there definitely are dumber moves out there, moves that were a lot more clear-cut there. Again, even in this world, Yvette is essentially one goodbye message away from winning the game anyway. To be fair, that's probably more of an indictment against Maggie than anything. Anyway, we get to the final part of the HOH, the typical Q&A about the jury, with both getting most of the questions wrong here, where it ends up coming down to the tiebreaker of how many votes to evict were cast, with both somehow answering the same exact answer and both getting it wrong, which is weird, but at least to a second tiebreaker question of how many hours have you lived in the Big Brother house, with both also just completely overshooting here by over 100, though here Janelle answers 1900 while Yvette answers 1875, giving her the win, and ultimately the loss of the season, where she obviously proceeds to evict Janelle, with Yvette funnily saying on Janelle's way out, "I'll be voting you in if there's a BBL Stars, which is like, how did she know that they were going to be voting people in? But to go back to the like historical context of all this, I remember at the time, I was so devastated seeing this final result, where obviously, again, I was a big Kaser fan. Once Kaser went, all my eggs went to the Janelle bandwagon. And to see Janelle get so close to the win and just barely miss out on it here was just so tragic, especially with Maggie and Yvette, of all people, getting to the final two instead. Two of the most repulsive people from my point of view at the time. Two people that, again, were absolutely hated by pretty much the entire fan base. So where, again, at the time, there was near universal love for Janelle and the Sovereigns. And again, for the season to culminate in Janelle being this fallen angel, and again, two of the most unlikable people to be a guaranteed winner here was just such a blow at the time, though I think in retrospect kind of probably actually adds to the appeal of this season. And with that, obviously we lose Janelle, and Janelle obviously, again, one of the most iconic players in Big Brother history, if not the most iconic player in Big Brother history. And while she obviously just further adds to her reputation in BB All-Stars, in BB6 here, again, she still has a pretty great run. Now, obviously, again, she's not as good at competitions as she is following this. And again, I think a lot of her reputation nowadays really comes from her competition prowess. But on BB6, though, I think she actually comes off as a much better character. I think she has so many more iconic character moments. Again, so many fun confrontations. Has so many great one-liners, from giving that key bitch and bye-bye bitches. And while she also has some, again, problematic things as well. Again, who doesn't on BB6? So where, again, I still think Janelle ends up being an incredible character coming out of BB6. Now, as a player, a bit more of a mixed bag. I think Janelle is a player here that, again, probably can't win at the end. And to be fair, again, there definitely were some bias in play against her, from people just thinking she's a mean girl from the very beginning and not wanting to associate with her, but still leaves Janelle in a near unwinnable situation. And to be fair, again, also a lot of that comes down to Howie making the mistake he does. But yeah, I still think Janelle's navigation through the game, again, is definitely sloppy, but ends up providing for, again, such an iconic run here. Again, the fact that she gets so close to the end and just barely misses out on it, playing from the bottom pretty much the entire time, again, just made her such a rootable underdog throughout the season. And again, probably the most popular player in Big Brother history up to this point. But then we move on to the finale, which starts off with the long season recap going through the season week by week. But we follow that up with some pretty boring content around Maggie and Yvette talking about their games with no real depth there, because, again, neither of them really own up to their games. But again, it's followed by the jury roundtable, which is a pretty fun one. Again, Janelle coming in, talking about having been taken out by the nerd herd, which I will say, I did forget to mention the fact that, yeah, the Sovereigns did call the friendship the nerd herd the entire season. Again, it's not actually that relevant, but I just felt like I needed to add that somewhere. But again, a lot of talk here about how Yvette made a $450,000 mistake. But despite that, we do see Janelle clearly trying to prop up Yvette in this spot, becoming a big advocate for Yvette on the jury, really propping her up as a competitor in comparison to Maggie, portraying Maggie as someone that ride coattails in the alliance instead of controlling it, with Janelle seeming to be very anti-Maggie, particularly in the fact that Maggie kind of played from the shadows for a lot of the game, didn't really end up being in positions to make a lot of decisions, which seemed to frustrate her. Oh, we do see Howie being upset at Yvette for preaching about integrity and not living up to it, when it's like, again, technically Maggie did the same thing. Again, I feel like both of them literally did the same thing and both went against their word at the same time. So where I find it weird how, like, Howie's using this as like a pro-Maggie, anti-Yvette take, when really it's like both of them did this. But again, we end up having Rachel here obviously being extremely anti-Yvette, saying that she made it personal and she's a piece of trash in her eyes, with, again, just being so clear that Yvette burned her jury vote through her goodbye message. But again, we do get to jury questioning, which, to be honest, was not particularly interesting. Neither of them performed particularly well. Again, none of them owned up to their games. Again, Maggie just doesn't even take credit for the Howie move or even the Kaser move, and says that she's here because of her team, which, again, I think further adds to this notion from the likes of Janelle and James that she was just like kind of riding coattails instead of controlling the game. All we see from Yvette that she can't even give a reason for why you would not vote for Maggie, while continuing to go on about how she hasn't lied in this game and was too honest, and talks about how she deserves the money because she played being Yvette. Again, what the fuck does that mean? But again, we do leave all this with James saying that he was originally leaning Maggie, but now thinks Yvette should win because she was loyal to her alliance, while Maggie was only loyal to herself, which was a weird take. I don't know why this is something that James believes. Now, again, I think the reality is that he just liked Yvette more than Maggie and just wanted Yvette to win. But again, I do feel like this being his rationale for his vote was very strange. But anyway, the jury coming out to the live show with big cheers for the Sovereigns, a massive cheer for Janelle in particular, where, again, it is really funny that we can see April in the background just being annoyed. Anyway, we get to the jury voting with Howie being saved for last, with Julie saying that he's the star of the show because we need to boost his ego even more. But again, Howie does end up saying that he can't vote for America's #1 choices, so he's stuck voting for our last choices. To which we see Howie proceed to like fumble around a bit as he ends up putting his key, which again, we'll get to that. But obviously after this, we get the reunion with the preacher coming out with no cheers for Eric, but a massive one for Kaser. And we do get some weird interactions from all this. We have like Sarah saying she wished James knew how good of friends Rachel, Howie, and Janelle were, and that him going was not their fault, when it's like, again, this is technically Howie's fault. Where again, it kind of felt like her pandering to Sovereign fans. All while we see Eric talking about how Maggie played the best game is ever seen, which, like, to be fair, again, probably a take that's aged pretty well at this point. Even though, again, I criticize Maggie's game, I do think, again, up to this point in Big Brother, I think she has probably played the best game. Beyond that, we get some, again, weird content around Michael, him being asked about his allegations against him. And again, them weirdly portraying him as the hero, with him talking about how he got some great feedback from those who watch the feeds, when it's like, again, you did do some problematic things. Oh, we also get some weird content from Howie, where he's like asked about his comments about April, and he said it was strictly for TV, and proceeds to apologize to her and kisses her on the cheek over and over again, which again just also felt weird to do. Oh, we have April being confronted about her comments about Janelle and America, which is funny to do in front of a live audience. But we also get a pretty tame confrontation between Jennifer and Kaser, a spot where they really were hyping this up coming into this segment, only for it to just be a spot where Kaser says, "Next time, think for yourself." And Jennifer says, "Yeah, I agree. I didn't." Again, that was all really lame. What was actually the more interesting part of all this was Eric trying to butt in, saying it's ironic that she did what Kaser did to him, and he gets hated for it, which leads to the entire crowd booing him, which was funny. But anyway, this segment ends with Sarah and James getting to embrace, so good for them. But ultimately get to the winner reveal, which ends up being a very tense vote here. Obviously, it's back and forth between Maggie and Yvette, where we see Bo obviously voting for Yvette alongside James and Janelle, as previously implied. Oh, we see April and Jen voting for Maggie, obviously being closer to her than Yvette, alongside Rachel, who's obviously burned by Yvette and closer to Maggie anyway, to where the game comes down to Howie's vote, obviously the star of the show, where, again, his allies voted in different ways, so where's Howie gonna vote? So we get the reveal of the final vote, which ends up being for Maggie. Maggie wins Big Brother 6. The question is, how intentional was it? Where this ends up being a story that really got passed around following this, about how Howie supposedly pulled what we now know as a topaz, accidentally voting for the wrong person, where again, this ended up being talked about a lot at the time, that Howie was meant to vote for Yvette and accidentally didn't vote that way, where I remember seeing a clip online of the BB7 live feeds with Janelle and James talking about the situation, and a spot where, again, Janelle and James thought Yvette won the game, where they thought they got Howie to vote for Yvette, and that Yvette was going to win in this spot, in a spot where, even if you look at the background as the votes are getting revealed, you could see Janelle prodding Howie for how he voted, to where, again, coming into this vote, it did seem like that contingent of the jury, the friendship minus Rachel, were actively trying to give Yvette the win, and we're in the assumption that Howie was on board, only for him to ultimately not do that. Now, again, there are multiple theories on how this came around, where, again, the implication at the time is that Howie did this by accident. Oh, again, I simply do not believe this to be true. I don't think Howie is that dumb. Again, Howie obviously made a lot of boneheaded decisions, but I don't think he's in a spot where he voted the incorrect way, especially considering the fact that, again, we see him taking a lot of time deciding which key to put in. It's not like a topaz situation where she was just so careless when she put her key in. Especially when, again, like, Howie was at least the fan between him and Rachel. Where it's not like Howie doesn't understand how the game works, to where, again, I do not believe that side of the story. I do think what this vote likely came down to was Rachel, where, again, with how anti-Yvette Rachel was, and again, Rachel being a friend from home for Howie, I do think the more likely story here is that Howie voted how Rachel wanted him to, over, again, him doing it by accident, where, again, I know there's even rumors about how exactly this came around as well, where, again, there's rumors about how, like, Rachel threatened their friendship if Howie voted for Yvette, which, again, I don't know if it necessarily went that far, as, again, I feel like that'll be a very weird thing for Rachel to do, but I do feel like it is a spot where, obviously, again, Howie knew how anti-Yvette Rachel was, and I do think he decided to vote alongside Rachel in this spot over the likes of Janelle and James. I think what likely happened is the fact that Howie just told James and Janelle that he voted incorrectly to kind of save face with them, but ultimately, obviously, again, knew what he was doing. And again, Maggie ends up winning the season in what was very controversial at the time. Again, Maggie was really hated at the time. And again, it's not like the Yvette win would have gone over much better. But again, Maggie does spend years being, like, easily the most hated winner of Big Brother, to the point where she completely leaves the Big Brother community. Mind you, again, I don't know if Maggie was ever that invested in the Big Brother community to begin with. Again, she was not a fan. Eric was the fan, where even I believe the story was that Eric was meant to actually go into the house with his wife, and his wife did not want to do it, so then they end up picking Maggie instead. Where again, Maggie is someone that just had like very little connection to Big Brother to begin with, to where again, her ultimately not staying with the community is not particularly shocking, but it's still a spot where again, I do think obviously the amount of hatred that she got for is probably a major reason why she doesn't associate with the community. Where I know she hasn't shown up at like the BB6 reunions that were done more recently, and really the only time I've even seen Maggie post Big Brothers, I know she was at like a 2009 party post like BB11. But again, Maggie's win here again was one that had a lot of ire at the time. I remember I was so disappointed at the Maggie win, or even in the Maggie versus Yvette situation, I would have much rather Yvette win the game. Where again, I remember me being very disappointed at the time at this win. That being said, in retrospect, I do think the Maggie win is actually really interesting. Obviously, Maggie is again the first winner of Big Brother to really play a dominant game, to really run her alliance and run it all the way to the end. Where obviously, again, we've had other winners that have played pretty solid games. Again, I think Drew played a very solid game playing the middle for most of the season. Again, June obviously played a very good floater game. And we've had like pretty good, like dominant non-winning games from the likes of Nicole and Danielle. Maggie is the person that, again, was able to be in those sort of positions, but go on to win. And I feel like that is a very interesting precedent to set for Big Brother. Again, a level of dominance that we don't really see from Big Brother too often, especially until more modern days, where, again, I think Maggie's win here, again, in retrospect, from a gameplay perspective, is a shake up of the traditional type of wins that we get from Big Brother. But with that said, again, still going to talk about the finalists before we wrap up the video. Stop talking about Yvette. And that's a player here that I obviously have very mixed opinions on. Obviously, she comes extremely close to winning, and she comes one vote away from winning. Mind you, again, she actively burned that jury vote to not win, but still, again, one vote away from winning, and some would argue she was meant to win the game. But despite that, again, obviously Yvette's path to the end is obviously very rocky, and she's someone that was being targeted for a lot of the season, but ultimately just never catches up to her. She also is in a spot where she actively burns jury votes. She actively gets into fights with people that burns her social capital. And again, I think those are also major criticisms to be had with Yvette's game. That being said, again, I think there are moments of good gameplay from Yvette. We do see Yvette being pretty influential at points. Again, being the first to bring up the Kaser blindside during his second eviction. Again, doing a lot of good work in keeping James around for as long as she did. I do think there's some savviness there that, again, I think would have been really interesting to see if she ever returned. Where obviously we saw her, again, be in the fan vote for BB7, obviously not get voted in. Later, again, was supposedly in the running for BB22 and didn't make it in by the end. But again, I would have loved to see an Yvette return, because I do think it would have been really interesting. Now, again, outside that, some of the things she does say are pretty problematic, and that's definitely something you could definitely quibble with Yvette, but I would assume not exactly that person nowadays. And really outside that, again, there are moments though on the show that she does make for incredible TV. She is a great confessionalist. She can be very humorous at points, and again, she's just a very messy personality, to where, again, even though I hated Yvette at the time, I have grown to enjoy Yvette on the TV show, even though, again, there definitely are some things that haven't aged particularly well. And with that, now let's move on to the winner in Maggie. And again, I already mentioned the fact that Maggie is a pretty dominant winner. However, I think my thing with Maggie is I do think some people really overstate how much of a dominant winner she is, where a lot of people talk about how she ran this cult and ran the game from beginning to end, and that's not really the full story. Again, I do think she does some very good things in the game. Again, able to cultivate this one side to stick together. And again, I think the major thing to really credit her for is the fact that she's the glue of that alliance. She is really the one keeping together all these very hectic personalities that don't even necessarily like each other that much, particularly April and Yvette. And again, getting them to not turn against each other, I think is very good gameplay. However, I think a major criticism I do have of her game is the fact that she was not really able to branch out beyond her alliance. Again, the people outside of her alliance hated her, had no respect for her, and that's a major reason why she barely wins against Yvette. And some people would say that she shouldn't have won against Yvette. And again, I think that is something that is definitely one of the bigger criticisms we had of Maggie's game. The fact that, again, people like James, people like Janelle, despite recognizing the influence she had at points, simply just did not respect the game that she played because of just how little personal connection they had to her. And I think that is something that makes me question just how good of a player Maggie actually is, especially considering how unintentional her game seems to be. I do feel like she's in a spot where, again, she kind of unintentionally plays an extremely dominant game. Dominant in quotations, as again, still there are points where the minority are targeting her, and that minority does win power at points. And to be fair, again, she does do good work during like the Howie boot week to keep the target off her back, and her being saved that like the final 9 is due to, again, her getting Jen to really blow up her game the previous round. But again, she was able to position herself in her alliance extremely well, and was a major reason why that group had the numbers coming into the jury with, again, what she was able to do with Howie, to where I do think Maggie deserves a lot of credit for her game. I just, again, don't think it was intentional. Where, again, I don't think she was actively utilizing Cappy's blindside as this way to cultivate this group for strategic reasons. I think she just did it because she genuinely believed it, because she genuinely was upset at Cappy being blindsided and genuinely wanted revenge for Cappy. Now, again, she had a major say in, again, getting Howie to put up James and Sarah, and again, getting Jennifer to put up Kaser. Yeah, again, she doesn't really take ownership of that ever, because, again, I just don't think Maggie's game is particularly intentional, which, again, isn't the biggest criticism in the world for me, especially when assessing her game on this season. It's more so criticism of, like, how she would do if she were to ever return, which, again, we'll never see. I don't think Maggie has any intention of ever playing again. I don't think producers ever have any intention of ever bring her back. But I do think, again, as a player, I still do just have these question marks on Maggie. But again, based on what she did demonstrate on the season, again, there is a lot of impressive play there. Now, again, as a TV character, she was not likable in the slightest. I hated her at the time. Again, most people hated her at the time. And even in the modern day, she's just not particularly interesting. She's just a very normal person. And one that, again, comes off very self-righteous at points. But again, at least with the likes of, again, like Brol and Yvette, who do have that as well, they at least came off as fun characters. Again, had good confessionals, got into fun fights. Maggie really does none of that. And Maggie really is someone that, again, is certainly up there amongst the most boring winners of Big Brother, which, again, I think made her win a lot less palatable in that sense, where, again, at least with Yvette, at least she was interesting on the show, with Maggie just coming off very dull. But again, I think from a historical context, again, seeing how impressive a game Maggie was able to play at this point in Big Brother is something that, again, definitely is to be commended, even though I don't know how intentional that game is. But either way, with that, those are all my thoughts on Big Brother 6. Having talked through the season from beginning to end, obviously a very iconic season, a formulative season for me. Really the season that truly got me into reality television, where while I had watched seasons of Survivor before this, Big Brother was really my show as I was younger, and BB6 is really the main reason why it was my show. Or while I started watching with BB5, BB6 was really the season that really sucked me in. Again, if it was not for the likes of Kaser and Janelle, I probably wouldn't be running a YouTube channel that largely focused on reality television. And again, I do think BB6 is a very important season to me, and very important for a lot of the fan base. Again, BB6 is still a very well-renowned season, looked at as one of the best of all time. Again, having so many fun character moments. Again, having a very fun split house dynamic, having some iconic characters. I will say my big criticism of the season from a modern perspective is how stagnant some of the gameplay gets, particularly in the back portion of it, where, again, while there is some fun drama still happening periodically, I do feel like a lot of the game really just comes down to competitions by the end, which is definitely something that kind of lessens my love of the season from a modern perspective, and is the reason why it's not my favorite season of all time, despite how nostalgic it is. But it is still an incredible season, which will always be the most nostalgic season of any reality show for me personally. But again, with that, those are my thoughts on BB6. Now, obviously, I'll be back a year from now to do a BB7 retrospective, probably. Beyond that, obviously, I do have the typical player ranking for BB6 that will come out eventually, probably closer to the finale date of BB27. Also, beyond that, this will obviously be coming out around the time BB27 starting, so I'll obviously be doing coverage of that, the mid-season power ranking, review, player ranking of that. Also, again, I have other Big Brother videos planned where, again, I try to do some more Big Brother videos during the Big Brother season this time around that I have for years in the past, where I know I've made a few casting videos, some rankings, some redo videos I've done in the past. Again, stay tuned for those down the road. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.